You set foot on foreign soil. Only this land isn't ruled by any country or government. In this land we celebrate music. In this land we celebrate games. In this land we celebrate those who compose video game music. Welcome to the VG Embassy. Welcome and thanks for tuning in to another episode of the VG Embassy. This is a show centered around video game music and the amazing online community of fans and podcasters that enjoy it. My name's Ed, and on each episode I'll take the role of Prime VGM Minister and invite a guest VG Ambassador onto the show to share with us their own video game music culture, or I may share a part of my culture on a solo show. And ladies and gentlemen, you are listening to episode 41, Metal Gear Memories 2, and if you recall Metal Gear Memories 1, I had a very special guest, VG Ambassador Gene from Pixelated Audio with me to discuss in pretty great detail the adventures of Solid Snake and Big Boss and Liquid Snake and Raiden through the Metal Gear series of games. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the more non-canonical, maybe some of the wackier side of Metal Gear. So, Gene, thanks for being on the show, and welcome back to the Embassy.
It's great to be back. I see you've made a few changes around here.
Yeah, we're cleaning up from the apocalyptic show. We're kind of unboarding the windows, painting all the walls again. And I've got lots and lots of cardboard boxes laying around from all the stuff that I have to put back up. So I figured it would be a nice little Metal Gear homage hanging out.
Well, that's good, because I feel very comfortable in those cardboard boxes.
Excellent.
At home, even.
And make sure you keep those cigarettes burning, because you don't want to hit those red tripwires as we go through the show here.
As long as you don't have them in the boxes, we're all good.
All right. So tell me a little bit about these games. Why are they kept separate from the canon games? Like, why are we featuring them in this episode versus the first one?
So, as you may recall, listeners, if you were here for the first one, we talked about basically the entire main Metal Gear series, starting with the original MSX, whatever, all the way up to Metal Gear Solid 5. Sort of parallel to all of this, there have been a number of side games. Some of them are just really unusual, and because the series has become so huge over the years, we've had releases from basically since the beginning, pretty close to it, and they don't get talked about as much, but many of them feature music that's as good, or in some cases better, than some of the main series games. So I like to do things that are a little bit on the less well-known side, so talking about something that's a little bit underrated in a pretty well-known series is part of why I'm excited to do the show.
Awesome. So a lot of these games have music that kind of crosses over with their canon counterparts, so we'll have a lot of games that we're featuring in this episode that are kind of like sub-games or complementary features to the real numbered games that came out, so a lot of these soundtracks might sound very reminiscent from music that we listened to in the first volume, but there are also some games that are completely standalone, maybe even not even released by Konami. We have got a couple of like homebrew style games in here, so you might hear some very different and interesting music as we go through the show. So I'm really looking forward to talking about them and sharing them with you guys.
As am I.
Awesome. So that said, do you want to start off with our first track?
Yes. So going all the way back, we're going to do chronological order pretty much. This is going to Snake's Revenge, the pseudo-unofficial sequel by Konami, released for the NES in 1990. The track we're listening to is Jungle Infiltration, composed by Tsutomu Ogura.
This was released on the NES in 1990. That was Jungle Infiltration from Snake's Revenge, composed by Tsutomu Ugura. That came out on the NES in 1990. And if I didn't know this was from a Konami game, just hearing that one track would clue me in. It feels very 1990 NES Konami. Just the drums and the tones and the instrument set that they're using is extremely reminiscent of all those games like Bayou Billy and Ninja Turtles and Blades of Steel, all those games that came out around that time.
It's a classic late NES Konami track, which is always good.
Absolutely.
I love that sound, that house sound that they developed at that time, and I know so many people do, and I never get tired of it.
Even though Konami used a ton of composers back then, they all seem to really have this kind of homogeneous sound. So I often wonder if it's just the influence of one director that kind of wanted them to all follow this one kind of tempo and one kind of tone, or whether they all kind of studied under the same people that kind of helped them all get this same sound. I mean, all of them kind of grew into their own styles as the years went on and they grew past the NES, but back then it just seemed like you couldn't really tell who did what unless you had actual composer credits at the end. It's really interesting.
Well, we talk about this all the time on our various shows, but back in the day, I think that was kind of the point. The whole obscuring who wrote the track, and just so that they wouldn't be swiped by another company.
yeah, and their music was almost kind of like their branding in a sense, like their audio trademarks. So I can understand why they kind of wanted their music to have this one particular kind of recognizable sound to it. And this is very indicative of that for Konami for sure.
Totally. So let's talk about the game a little bit.
Absolutely. So I have very limited memory of this game. This is one of the few games in the show that I have actually played, and I think I played this one before even knowing about the original Metal Gear game. This was a game that I used to have at my grandparents' house, so I would only play it on the weekends when I went there. I have no idea how the game ended up at my grandparents' house. I think sometimes my grandfather would just go and buy games and kind of slip them into the collection without us realizing. This is not a game that I think I would have picked up had I seen it on the shelf or anything, but I remember playing a little bit of it and just thinking about how different it was from the games that I would play before. Previously it would just be like straight up action games. Everything was like go, 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 real time. You need to do things now. And Snake's Revenge really kind of introduced the concept of waiting and making sure people weren't looking and sneaking. And these were just things that little Ed's brain didn't really understand why you would want to do that in a video game. So, I don't know, what was your first experience? So had you played a Metal Gear game before you played this one?
Well, yeah, my first experience was with the first Metal Gear, the original, well, technically not the original, the one that was on the NES, which was kind of a crappy downport from the MSX game. I actually didn't play this one until many years later, during the era when information about games was scarce, like the 90s and the internet and all of that. With a title like Snake's Revenge, I really didn't put two and two together until after I think I'd played Metal Gear Solid around 2000 maybe, so maybe a good 10 years later. I am a little bit mixed on this one. Number one, it's just kind of more of the same of the original Metal Gear, which I didn't love to begin with. I love the music. I thought it was really good, and this one I actually like it a little bit better. Maybe not overall, but the highs in this soundtrack I think are better than the first one.
Yeah, I agree.
Otherwise, I don't know what there is to say. The story of the game itself is probably more interesting than the actual thing that came out. So after the pseudo success of the first game, it wasn't really a huge hit. It wasn't even really a sleeper hit. It was just sort of like, it did okay. Konami decided that they wanted to do a sequel to it, and they didn't even consult Kojima at the time. They were like, well, Americans, military, Stallone, just slap another Metal Gear game together, make the guy more muscular and, more guns, more enemies. That'll sell.
More America.
And more America. Actually, that's what's so funny is like the series has always been more popular in Western regions than it has in Japan, and that wasn't really any different here. This never even came out in Japan. And the famous story is that Kojima was on a train when he found out that one of the developers on his team was working on a sequel that he didn't even know about. And then that spawned the real Metal Gear 2 that was on MSX. And then, honestly, without this game, there would be no Metal Gear series. It would just be like Metal Gear 1, and then maybe, another take 5 years after that, and who knows if the series would have taken off, really.
That's crazy. That's kind of like just seeing like somebody cloned your baby and didn't tell you. Then you just kind of learn it exists. I can imagine Kojima must have been pretty taken aback when he heard that.
I love his response, though. It was sort of like, okay, let's start planning the real one. That was basically, that was like all, he didn't, I don't think he was even that upset about it after the initial shock. It was sort of like, well, I don't know how good it's going to be without my involvement, so let's just do it up for real. And, he was probably right. This one was really just kind of I won't say phoned in, but it does feel like there wasn't a whole lot of inspired design behind it.
Yeah, and the series was brand new at the time, so I guess, it's not like nowadays where Kojima's last name is synonymous with the series. Back then it was, Konami was putting out series of games left and right, and the director of the original Ninja Turtles game wasn't necessarily the director of the Ninja Turtles 2 the arcade game or the Manhattan Project. So to them it must have just been like, hey, okay, now we have this new franchise, we're going to make a sequel, who do we have available to direct it? This guy over here. Okay, let's do that. So I think maybe it was kind of a disconnect where, unlike maybe some of the other directors of other Konami games, Kojima really felt like he had ownership personally over the series, and so he might not have even realized that himself until he found out that somebody else was doing a game based on that universe, and he was like, whoa, wait a second, this feels weird. Now I want to take ownership.
Yeah.
And it might have been that very same train conversation that just the way that he found out really made him feel like he wanted to own this series, and which is why he just kept going and going and going with it.
Yeah, the funny thing about that whole thing is I think if you were to ask him, Kojima would be very upfront about the whole, this is really just like ripping off tropes of 80s action movies. Basically, that's his life, is he's always wanted to be a film director, it seems like. He just kind of landed in games. I don't have like deep interviews, but he has so many different quotes. There's an interview of him with Guillermo del Toro, and it was like, this was what his whole life was working towards. So I think it was like initially kind of like original character, do not steal in the internet parlance. And then he's like, but wait, I spent all this time making this game, I might as well give it another go and, see where it ends up.
And it ended up being pretty darn good. And I don't think the sequel ever ended up coming out in the US, right?
Not until many, many years later. Metal Gear Solid 3 included it as a like little Easter egg bonus kind of. You could play it. It was fully in English, but it was definitely not why you bought the game. It was just, well, here's kind of one of the games that really launched the series as we know it, with the mechanics and all of that sort of stuff.
Right. So to us Americans who had no idea what was going on in Japan because of lack of the internet, etc., Snake's Revenge was the true sequel to the original game until that came out many, many years later. So pretty interesting.
Kojima has gone on record to say that this game is not canon. So we kick it off right.
Exactly. So speaking of not canon, let's move into our next game. What do we got coming up?
Sure. This is from Metal Gear Solid Integral. This is VR Training Advanced Mode.
Cool. So this was originally composed by Konami Kukeha Club for Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, and arranged by a whole lot of people. David Downs, Gigi Moroni, Hiroyuki Togo, Jun Myung Lee, Kazuki Muraoka, Rika Muranaka, Takanari Ishiyama, and Tapi Iwase.
Yes.
right? That was VR Training Advanced Mode from Metal Gear Solid Integral, as it was called in Japan, or the VR Missions, as it was called in the US, or Special Missions, as it was called in Europe. That was released originally on the PS1 in 1999. And that's an arrangement of a tune composed by the Konami Kukeha Club for Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, and arranged by a whole bunch of people: David Downs, Gigi Moroni, Hiroyuki Togo, Jun Myung Lee, Kazuki Muraoka, Rika Muranaka, Takanari Ishiyama, and Tapi Iwase. I wish we had individual artist notes for these tracks, but this one really reminds me of a lot of the music that came out of the original Metal Gear Solid soundtrack. Does that sound right to you?
That is. I mean, the instrument set is definitely the Metal Gear Solid one, and the reason why I picked this track, there's actually about 3 or 4 tracks that I would have picked. There's Metal Gear 2, and I'm actually kind of sad that both of us picked these really somber, serious tracks for the last episode. And I'm like, we need to have at least one of the more iconic Metal Gear 2 tracks.
Yeah.
So almost all of them, the ones that are the most recognizable, made it back, and they actually make it back in a few other games. So they tend to get used for VR missions because they're sort of like the theme of Solid Snake, the character Solid Snake. It's not in every Metal Gear. So we have this track, and there's, I'm not going to sing them for you, but there's about 3 or 4 other ones. So I figured, what better way to do an episode about non-canon than to have a track from Metal Gear Solid that's a remix of Metal Gear 2.
Yes. And I think that's pretty indicative of the kind of music that and as these games started coming out, the music started becoming more, I don't want to say recycled, but reimagined over and over and over again. And pretty soon it's like, kind of like we just did a show on the Kirby series with, me and Logan, and it's like after the 8th iteration of the Kirby games, you can't even remember where the original songs came from anymore because they've been remixed so many times. And I feel like a lot of that happens in the Metal Gear Solid series as well.
Definitely. Kojima's a big fan of sort of cheeky callbacks, and not even in the way of like remixes, just sometimes the songs will appear in really unusual places. Like in the later games, you can roam around listening to a cassette of like 8-bit Castlevania remixes if you really want. Like, doesn't make sense, but it's sure. I mean it does. Like, it's a Konami game, but everything else about it is like, this is super strange.
Yeah. I like that this is also sequence music too. It sounds like it's rich enough and well composed enough that it could be like Red Book audio, but it's all sequenced music from within the PS1 audio chip. And I don't know, it's very rich sounding in that it's got multiple instruments all kind of doing something different, but all fitting very, very well together. Like, you've got the violin swells, and then the arpeggios, and the bass is just kind of doing its own thing, but depending on what you listen to, it almost sounds like the song has a different pace. So it's very versatile for a video game, I think, especially in something like VR missions where you're doing equal amounts of kind of like sneaking and then doing running and time stuff. This music can almost take on the characterization of any kind of gameplay that you're experiencing on the screen at the moment. So I really like that about it.
Me too. And we're 20 years out now from when Metal Gear Solid Integral released, the sort of the re-release of Metal Gear Solid with all of these VR missions. And in a way, PS1 music is its own sort of time capsule, the way 8 and 16-bit music is. It's obviously fuller, but there's still those hardware limitations. Some of it's sequenced, some of the samples aren't as good. And, if you grew up with that, and like a lot of our listeners, I think you get a little nostalgic for it. Like, obviously, soundtracks today have basically whatever you want to put in it. But we were still at that edge of, well, we'll do the best we can because we have to put a lot of game onto these discs. So let's, can we use sequenced music instead so it won't take up as much space? So I don't know, I've become quite fond of the PS1 soundtrack, even though musically I feel like the series has gotten better over time. It still holds a very dear place in my heart.
Yeah, it's really the kind of like most stripped down, back to basic melodies of the series, just because of the limitations of the, MIDI-like sound sequencing of the original PlayStation. So it's It's pretty cool. So tell me a little bit more about this VR missions. So I know that it kind of uses the original Metal Gear Solid game engine, but kind of just makes it more into like an arcade style game, if I remember correctly.
Sort of. So in the original Metal Gear Solid, there are a few of these VR missions. They're pretty basic. It's sort of like, take out the target, reach the end without getting spotted. There's a few of these kind of variations on the theme. They're not super complex. Something I think Kojima really enjoyed playing around with, and I'm going to speak for him a lot on this episode, is he expanded on it a whole bunch. Like, basically anything that he couldn't fit into the main game kind of ends up in these VR missions. They're obviously not canon. They take place in these like VR worlds where there's geometric shapes making up the background, and soldiers will phase in and people don't really die. They kind of go in and out of like the sort of the Matrix.
Right, yep.
You know, the stereotype of VR in the 90s. And so you can experience these really unusual gameplay modes. So there are all these really short self-contained areas. Some of them make future appearances, like 1v1 battles where you fight increasingly harder enemies. There are ones where you have to fight a large number of people. There's some really weird ones, like mystery ones, where you'll have these soldiers in a line, like standing right next to each other, and it'll say, one of these is the murderer, figure it out. And you'll see a person that's like lying on the floor randomly, and then you'll see maybe some footsteps going over to a cardboard box, and the cardboard box will point to the soldier who's like scratching his butt or whatever. It's like there's no combat in it. It's just this, what can we do with this basically square grid and move this character around and have these kind of unusual scriptings. And there's a mode where you have the variety missions, which make a future appearance. One of them is drag a soldier by his neck all the way through the stage without getting spotted. So you're slowed down. There's one of them where it's like, knock these soldiers out, domino style. You like hit one and they all knock into the others.
That's awesome.
It's just very strange. And it's an opportunity to do that kind of, like, there's one series of stages where you can play as Gray Fox. I know a lot of people requested that, so you do some of the sneaking missions with him, and he's got his laser sword, saber thing, whatever. So it's just this kind of way to put in a lot of these non-canon things that are, and I keep saying that, but like just goofy stuff, really. Like that's what it's all about, is the Metal Gear series doesn't have to be so serious all the time.
Yeah, it sounds to me like, they realized that they created a very versatile engine, and there was so much more they could do with it that they didn't have a chance to really fit into the game without it seeming to, go off the rails a bit. So it almost sounds like he was just like having fun with the team. Like, hey, what can we come up with using what we've got? And just make some extra fun stuff. And I think, they didn't have to worry about creating the engine from scratch like they did for the game. They just kind of play with it and put people on a grid and see how they interact with each other, because, they basically created these little AI sequences and people react to each other differently. So some of these were a lot of like trial and error, just to like randomly play stuff and see how things fall. And a lot of them were really kind of thought out, especially towards the end, because I've seen some gameplay where a lot of the missions towards the end, it's like you've got to really do everything in a perfect sequence in order to pass the mission. So yeah, really goes very far to show what Kojima produced with this original Metal Gear engine.
Yeah.
And just how much farther he could go, and probably why Konami gave him so much leeway when he was making his additional games, because he kind of proved his mettle with this one.
Yeah, I don't know how often developers will go through and do this kind of thing. Like sometimes you'll see a game that has like a battle royale mode, or kind of like multiplayer like that, but I don't think many people go off the rails where you're like shooting at giant aliens, or you have to run through an area completely naked. I mean, that's a pretty much a Kojima hallmark at this point. So I can't wait for Death Stranding. I'm going to see how much of that is in there.
Oh, I can't wait to see Norman Reedus's butt. That's fantastic. Anyways. All right, let's move on to our next one. This is a Game Boy Color game. We're going to hear Departure, which is the credits theme from Metal Gear Ghost Babel, or just called Metal Gear Solid, composed by Norihiko Hibino and Kazuki Muraoka.
All right, that was Departure, or the credits theme, from Metal Gear Ghost Babel, also known as Metal Gear Solid, for the Game Boy Color, released in 2000, and composed by Norihiko Hibino and Kazuki Muraoka. What'd you think, Ed?
This is a really good track, and I love that it has a cold end, because it takes so many different... I'm not too familiar with the soundtrack itself. It sounds to me like this is perhaps... either a medley or something that uses a lot of the motifs of the Game Boy Color soundtrack that you hear as you're playing through the game, but it sounds like a really kind of somber kind of remembrance of all of the areas and locations and activities you've gone through as you beat the game. And even not playing the game, I can tell that like this would be a really good kind of audio reward for finishing the game. For a Game Boy Color soundtrack, the tones are really clear, and there are enough kind of changes in tone and different pieces that it keeps it very, very interesting, even if you're just looking at a scroll of names going up the screen. So I really, really like this one. Is that why you picked it?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why I picked this one. Number one, I actually had a hard time picking tracks from this soundtrack, not because they were all amazing, but actually it's a very atmospheric soundtrack. A lot of the music is... We're here at 2000, right? We're towards the end of the 8-bit, 16-bit era, so people are trying to be a little bit more atmospheric with their games, and so you have this really interesting challenge because you want to be atmospheric, but you're using this hardware that's now, 10 years, 12 years old at this point? The Game Boy sound chip is super primitive. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way, but like it's you got your 4 channels, so there's a lot more of this kind of like stewing, kind of creeping tracks where you hear a little bit more of the ambience, kind of tones going on in the background.
Yeah, especially at the beginning of the track, definitely you hear those kind of like winding up, almost like violin swells, and you almost think that the entire track is going to be like that until it really kind of kicks into gear and starts getting very melodic.
Yeah, that's the other thing, is like the track starts off as this almost like slow trip hop thing. I don't know, not exactly, but it's this weird mellow thing, and then it just picks up and you've got swells and crossing melodies, and then there's that tag towards the end, which is a total callback to some of the original Metal Gears. I think like the alert theme or boss theme, like the very first one. And so they're tying it in a very cool way, but it's still a very unique composition style. I think this is the first Metal Gear game by Norihiko Hibino, who's not exactly synonymous as a composer for this series, but he really should be, because he did a lot of really, really great work in Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3. Everybody thinks Harry Gregson Williams, but he just did the Hollywood thing, intro theme, and then all of the like heavy lifting was Hibino. So yeah, I don't know if he really knew the hardware that well, and I don't mean to say that he didn't write good music, but I think if he was just sort of coming in at this time, he might have tried a little bit of a different approach than the more traditional like chiptune style, and sometimes it was more effective, sometimes it was less effective. It's overall a good soundtrack, but it's a little bit more uneven, I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, oftentimes as we've started to learn more and more as we talk to more composers, is a lot of times these composers don't necessarily compose directly for the hardware that they're using. So it's very possible that these composers wrote kind of an ambient or an atmospheric soundtrack, and then it was implemented by sound directors or programmers that either went uncredited or were credited for other things in the game. So that's them kind of trying to approximate what they were trying to go for in their original soundtracks. But Norihiko Hibino is mainly like a jazz musician. He's a saxophonist. He learned music at Berkeley, lived in Kentucky for a while. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so he's got this much, and I think a lot of the more lighter and more melodic stuff that you hear in maybe the non-canonical Metal Gear stuff is maybe a lot of that kind of coming through. It's him kind of wanting to be a little more playful with his music than a lot of the atmospheric stuff. So I just really like that it kind of takes the Game Boy Color sound hardware into more of a 21st century kind of soundtrack aesthetic. That it's a really kind of cool, like you said, kind of in the middle. I'm still 8-bit, but I'm also reaching into like the 32-bit era and hearing what those 32-bit influences on an 8-bit chiptune device before it became like cool and retro actually sounded like. So this is a neat little piece of history.
Definitely, yeah. That sort of contemporary, at the time, sound philosophy or approach using old hardware, I think is why chiptunes are still quite popular today. It's using that exact same philosophy. The music's very different, but it's the same exact approach. I'm a huge fan of chiptune music, modern stuff, retro, just the whole gamut.
Me too. And so speaking of modern games and older sound hardware and older hardware, so this is an 8-bit game, very reminiscent of the original Metal Gear, but it's based on Metal Gear Solid, which was a 32-bit PlayStation 1 title. So how do they implement that in the game itself? Is it more like the original Metal Gear Solid plot, but done in the original Metal Gear style?
Kind of. I mean, it's definitely a side story. There's unique bosses and things like that.
Okay.
The way this game plays is kind of unusual. Like, you have the mechanics sort of Metal Gear Solid, except kind of a bird's eye top-down view. It's like three-fourths, I guess.
Okay.
You can press up against walls. The action's a little bit more smooth than it was in the original games. And what's most unusual is it's not like this huge interconnected world. You kind of play stages. Like, within a stage, you can kind of roam around freely. But as soon as you, say, beat a boss or complete some sort of checkpoint, like maybe you get some key cards to get some plot item, then it takes you to a new area, which, so you can't go back to the old sections. It's kind of unusual for this series, actually. It's not really something they did a whole lot. I'm so mixed about this game because the mechanics are fun. The game is pretty good, but there's a couple of really bad dips. There's one spot where you're in this conveyor belt maze that takes place across, I think, like 4 or 6 screens. So, like, you can't actually see where the conveyor belt goes. And there's about 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, some crazy number of entry points. And if you get on the wrong one, you can be stuck on that thing for like 30 seconds to a minute. It's a real, like, buzzkill.
Yeah, no, that doesn't sound like good game design at all.
The rest of the game is okay, but I remember feeling, like, so soured on that puzzle section that I found it a lot harder to enjoy the rest of it.
Interesting. Yeah, your description kind of reminds me a little bit of like Operation Logic Bomb on the Super Nintendo, where it's a little more, same kind of 3/4 view, but maybe a little more on the action side than, sneaking around and hiding from enemies rather than directly attacking them. So, pretty cool. I might have to check this one out. Looks fun.
Yeah, just use a guide when you get to the conveyor belt section. You'll know when you get there.
Yeah. Or I'll just hit the speed up button on the emulator and like make them just walk through more quickly. That'd be kind of fun.
That's the way you got to do it, yeah.
Perfect. All right, so next, I want to call it a game, but I don't really think it's even a game. What do we got coming up next?
This is the, air quotes, Metal Gear Solid main theme document remix from Document of Metal Gear Solid 2 for the PS2 in 2002, originally composed by Tappy and remixed by Norihiko Hibino.
Hey, he makes a return. All right, we'll be right back. All right, that was the Metal Gear Solid main theme document remix from Document of Metal Gear Solid 2. Came out on the PS2 in 2002, originally composed by Tappy Iwase and remixed by Norihiko Hibino. And see, now there you go, with those little hints of like jazzy saxophone in there. It's definitely Norihiko Hibino himself probably playing that, and they didn't just hire some session musician. But you can definitely hear a lot of like the jazz overtones and influences in this remix of the track, as well as some of those kind of like hip hop, almost drum and bass influenced breakbeats. This was a really cool little track.
I think the PS2 and that sort of full audio is where you unlock the potential of Norihiko Hibino.
Definitely. Yep.
I would say if I could live in one era musically, I really, really love the like Metal Gear Solid 2, 3 era. Like when I initially did this track list, I think I had another 2 or 3 Hibino tracks. I think I have one more after this, but it's just, I love that late 90s, early 2000s. You had trip hop, you had drum and bass, you had this sort of like jazz, Nova kind of stuff.
Yeah,
it was just this really awesome era. And I mean, I think I'm more nostalgic for it now than I don't think I listened to this kind of stuff all that much, the really jazzy kind of drum and bass, but I've really come to love it a lot. And the Metal Gear Solid 2 soundtrack is like a third of it at least is this kind of stuff. It's so good.
Yeah, I mean, it was referred to as acid jazz back in the day.
Yeah.
So I was actually really, really into it. Guys like Motion Worker, some really, really good stuff came out of those albums back in the day. So this really kind of threw me back to those older style acid jazz discs that I've still got kicking around in my closet somewhere. But you're right, and you know, I think Norihiko Hibino might be an excellent candidate for a Pixelated Audio focus at some point, because I think he's got a lot of really surprising and cool stuff out there to listen to.
Definitely, and as I mentioned, a little bit under the radar and probably deserves a little bit of attention.
Exactly. So, as I kind of hinted at before, this isn't really a game, right?
No, the document of Metal Gear Solid 2 is Kojima's first official way to try to pretend that he's a film director. He basically released this, I don't know what you would call it, like a bonus disc, which it didn't come with the original Metal Gear Solid 2. I think maybe a year later, newer releases of it, you could buy it separately, or a pre-order bonus. I don't remember exactly. I guess, I have it in my notes. It was a standalone release. I went through all this effort to try to get all this stuff ahead of time. But all it is really is a series of viewers. You can watch films of them recording on location in New York. There's a video of them getting weapons training from like a Japanese weapons master, like how to disarm somebody. Like you'll notice there was a huge increase in the quote-unquote realism of Metal Gear Solid, like trigger discipline and all of these things about like actual firearm usage. Like Kojima basically said, I have this huge budget, I'm going to spend it on basically everything. We're going to film on location in New York for some of these scenes. We're going to hire these military professionals. We're going to, hire a film composer, Harry Gregson Williams. So this is kind of his DVD where you can watch the cutscenes, the making of models throughout the game. You can listen to a little mini soundtrack. There's nothing. There's no game here. In fact, this used to be a joke between Jared and I. We would often re-gift each other pointless games. Things like he gave me the Oregon Trail one year for the Macintosh about 20 years after either of us had one. So I kept threatening him to get him this game because there's just something funny about saying the document of Metal Gear Solid 2. It's just such an overwrought title. So I ended up giving it to him about 3 or 4 years ago. It was a fun memory and not really worth picking up other than a couple of pretty cool music tracks. Yeah, I mean, I guess if you're really, really into, seeing how it was made, it might be interesting. But these kind of things, like I have a making of Silent Hill DVD that I've watched like maybe once or twice since I got it, and I paid a heck of a lot of money for it. So, they don't have obviously the replayability value that a real game would, but it's still pretty cool. And I like that Kojima he's like
serious, but at the same time, he's very tongue-in-cheek. Like, he goes really far out of his way to be tongue-in-cheek.
Oh, of course.
And you got to appreciate the effort that he goes into. So to not only have kind of a goofy series overall, where it's just really over the top, but also to make all the minutia of this action be so accurate, and to go through all this training to get it accurate, it's like it's a weird attention to detail that doesn't need to be there. So the fact that it's there makes it, I guess, just extra cool to me. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of the norm now, but in 2000, people were not hiring like motion capture artists and like consultants in the military to try to understand all of this stuff. Like you'll see it nowadays, but I don't even know if it was a matter of budget. I think he was just sort of a forward-thinking guy in that way. Like, why don't we take some of the techniques of film and apply it to games very literally, not just the, cutscene sort of thing.
Yeah. Or you can just sum it up as man with too much money makes video games.
That's about right.
But at least he's putting it to good use, and he's making some extra cool content for the fans, with it at the same time. So it all works out. He's always been, if nothing else, he's always been somebody who appreciates his fans and shows his fans that he wants to give them things that will entertain them and stuff that they're looking for the most part. There are a couple times where he's kind of trolled his fans, but lately he's, especially with Death Stranding, he's been very kind of forthcoming and appearing in public, across the world when he's been also during the development cycle, and kind of taking time away from his development to come and show games at award shows and stuff, and talking directly to people. So good on him for that.
Well, if you're not trolling your gamers, then what are you even doing as a game designer, really?
Exactly. This is the 2010-ishes. You have to be a troll to be successful in modern life. Anywho, I'm ready to move on to our next track. What do we got coming up?
So we have VR Mission Variety from Metal Gear Solid 2 Substance, released for a bunch of systems, but originally the PS2 in 2001. And this is also composed by Norihiko Hibino.
Interesting. Let's look out for some more saxophone. We'll be right back.
All right, that was VR Mission Variety from Metal Gear Solid 2 Substance for the PS2, PS3, a bunch of other systems, the Xbox, actually, released in 2002 and composed by Norihiko Hibino. And small correction on this one, I said 2001, but I was thinking of the original Metal Gear Solid 2. The Substance release, which is the first one to feature this track, was in 2002.
Ah, I see. Okay. Man, so I really like this one. It still has some of that kind of like acid jazz, house music influence, especially that B section where the time signature kind of goes a little bit wonky and not as dancey as the A section. Mm-hmm. But what really got me is that really grindy kind of LFO bass, just kind of like warbling underneath the whole thing. I just kept concentrating on that, and I love the sound he made for that one.
I really love this track. Number one, because it's just so... It's kind of a quirky track. Like, it starts off with those kind of atonal synth things in the beginning. It's sort of like, it's not really implying a particular key, which always kind of, it catches my ear right away every time it comes in, that do-do-do-do thing.
Yeah, little crescendos, yeah.
And I think my favorite thing is, and this is common throughout the entire soundtrack, that sort of the use of the filmic horns in a more melodic way, in a more like cut up in a dance track, rather than just like, here's an orchestral sequence, like here's a big, cinematic thing. I just really love how they're used throughout the soundtrack.
Yeah, that was huge back. This was like 2002. So like, Chemical Brothers, Propeller Heads, they were all doing that kind of stuff with those, lead instruments being very brassy and very choppy. So very, very indicative of the music at the time, for sure.
Definitely. And it's definitely a soundtrack that I go back to a lot. I talk about it all the time. I just love Metal Gear Solid 2's music so much. It's great for listening in the background.
So now, would you say like the soundtrack for Substance was more or less similar to this particular track? Because I noticed like with the VR missions, because it's a more action-oriented game and there's far less story, the music seemed to be a little more like upbeat and dancey. So does this kind of follow the same trope?
I'd say so, although there are a few tracks where, like, there's this one VR mission in particular where you're sneaking around in total darkness. I mean, it's not like 100% black, but it's really hard to see. And that's like a super kind of like sneaking around track, even somewhat more than some of the others in the soundtrack. But in general, yeah, there's a lot of these really upbeat, very punchy percussion and really kind of in-your-face synth and horn sounds and all that stuff. To kind of be clear, the music that was original to Substance, and there was quite a bit of it, let me actually go back and explain why that is. So when the original Metal Gear Solid 2 released, I don't believe there were actually any VR missions. I did not pick up the original release. I had to look. Somebody can double check. But I'm pretty sure it just launched without it because it was a pretty aggressive release. They were trying to get it out. It came out in 2001, which is only a year after the PS2 launched. And a game of its scale and magnitude, it was 60 frames per second. It was a totally new engine. Like they were really crammed in a lot in that development. So I think they probably had to make that decision and say, we just can't do the VR missions. So then people were probably disappointed. He's like, you want VR missions? Have VR missions. Have 500 VR missions. So there's so many missions in this one. And I specifically picked this track because as much as I love it, this is also the song that's playing, many of you know this, where you will rage quit the VR missions. There's a series of missions. You're perched up on this tiny ledge with a sniper rifle, and you have to defend something. Early on in the game, it's normal things like a downed person. And then as it gets further into the game, the later VR missions, it gets more ridiculous. Like, I'm defending a bowl of ramen or my cardboard box. So you have to snipe 20, 30 people before they get to the box, and they're all in these predetermined pathways, but just try to imagine keeping track of 30 guards. They're like taunting you, they're poking their heads out, they're hiding back. One person is kind of like taking an alternate route. There's a guy going straight down the center, but it's a little gulch. You can't see him. Ugh. And then you're like one guy away, and then he gets to the box, and you just turn off the system, and it's like, F this.
I can imagine. Holy cow.
I still love the track, though, even though I've gotten really angry while it's playing.
It always reminds me of like Hotline Miami, where you've created this whole kind of sequence of things you have to do to get to the end, and you finally master it, and like right at the end, this last dude just comes around the corner and beats you across the head with a baseball bat, and you start all over again. So,
it's the worst.
I can imagine.
This mission is the one that trips most people up. Is about 3 or 4 from the last VR mission. You can imagine how frustrating that must be. You've played through like 99.6% of the VR missions, and you just can't get past this one. That's like, for the completionist in me, that was just the most frustrating thing. And I had to put it down for like a month before I could come back to it.
Oh man. So this was never bundled with the original Metal Gear Solid 2 at all, like on one disc or anything that?
No. It was essentially additional content. Sorry, I wasn't clear about that at the beginning.
Okay.
So like the core game was there from the beginning, but because people wanted, what they loved the integral missions, so they added a whole bunch more. So you have this like full package, which is the main game, plus all of these VR missions. There's some additional bonus content. Some of them are actually kind of these weird like alt. They're called Snake Tales. So you play through like a section of the area as Snake, and there's like text story kind of explaining how, because if you follow the entire game of Metal Gear Solid 2, you'll find that the Snake character kind of ends up in random spots. Like, how did he get there before me? Mm-hmm. And so these tales are kind of like closing that gap or like pasting over it. So like, okay, how did Snake get from here to here while I was busy disarming these bombs or whatever it was? So it's not really all that different, but it's kind of these alternative missions where you have a different weapon set. And they're very short. You can usually beat them in like 20 or 30 minutes or sometimes less.
Okay, like little vignettes, basically.
Basically, I think there's like 5 or 6 of them. But to kind of round it out, I just wanted to say this game introduced a lot of different kinds of VR missions. In addition to some of the stuff that you saw in the old games, they also had like a bomb disposal mode. There's the like total darkness stuff, and the variety mode just went off the rails. There's one where you're fighting like a giant Godzilla-sized man who just roars at you and like sneezes you off the stage, and it's like, and there's like fittingly like stompy Godzilla monster music, like boom, 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 like
it just went all out basically.
Yeah, you're like hiding behind this box while this like snorting man monster is like peeking his head out towards you. This is what I mean. Like the VR missions are where they stuff in all of the craziness that doesn't make sense in the main game.
Yeah, it's the perfect excuse to just do whatever your heart desires, because you're not really constricted by any sort of canon or ruining future games or anything. So that's awesome. Just it's fun to see the developers having fun with their own game. So I really like that.
Me too. And if you have the original PS2 version, you can cut it up on the big shell in the little mini skateboarding game, which they never ported to anything else because it was kind of a pointless waste of resources. They're like, we're not going to build an entire skateboarding engine for the HD remake, so no, it's gone.
That's awesome. Very cool. All right. Ready to move on to our next track?
I am.
Okay, so what do we got coming up next?
This is Tank Hangar from Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, originally composed by the KCE Japan sound team for Metal Gear Solid 1, and arranged by a bunch of people who I'm not going to say.
I don't know if I have a hangar big enough for a tank.
No, mine's very small, maybe like a bicycle.
Yeah, just my coats and my shirts. Anyways, let's listen to the track. We'll be right back. All right, that was Tank Hangar from Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes, and that came out on the GameCube in 2004, originally composed by the KCE Japan sound team for Metal Gear Solid 1, and arranged by one or more of the following people: Stephen S. Hennepin, Dave Miner, Norihiko Hibino, Shiuchi Kobori, Toshiyuki Kakuda, and Waishiro Ozaki. All right, so this one feels like a thinking man's music. Very bassy and very cinematic, kind of unlike a lot of the stuff that you've picked previously for this show. This feels more like the stuff that we played in Volume 1, where it's very stealthy, very cinematic sounding, and very tension creating. So from what I remember from the original Metal Gear Solid and watching my brother play it, most of the soundtrack was like this. So is this a like an area that is specific to the Twin Snakes add-on for Metal Gear Solid?
So if I had been a real troll, I would have listened back to the first episode and exactly repeated what I said about the first time I spoke about this track. But this is essentially a remix. What else, right? We're playing Metal Gear Solid 1 and the Metal Gear Solid 2 engine with one of the few remakes or remixes from that soundtrack. Everything else is almost everything else is actually original music in the Twin Snakes version. So for those of you that don't know, Twin Snakes is a GameCube remaster, GameCube exclusive actually, version of Metal Gear Solid 1, and people are very mixed on it for a lot of reasons. First of all, I actually almost forgot about this game, even though I owned a copy of it and beat it a few times when I was going through for this show, partially because I couldn't remember any of the music except for like this and maybe one other track. I actually really don't like the soundtrack for the most part, which is why I picked this track, because it's one of the best tracks on it, because the original is so good.
Gotcha, so it seems like they only really succeeded when they were using stuff from the original material.
The Vulcan Raven fight's really cool, but it wasn't really what I wanted to play for the show, so I kind of left that one off. But definitely check it out. So it's kind of it's mixed. Like the original game had pretty much the same boss music for every boss. This one has unique boss music, but they're not very good most of the time. So it's kind of like it's a sort of a toss up there. It's kind of unfortunate.
Yeah, that's disappointing. So aside from the music, how was the game itself? I mean, it sounds like everyone's dream come true, where they kind of like updated the original beloved game to an engine that was very successful for Metal Gear Solid 2.
So I thought so. I really liked the Twin Snakes because it had a lot of little quality of life improvements. Frame rate was a big one. Makes the game a little bit too easy in spots, but now you can shoot enemies in first person, so it becomes less of the kind of Pac-Man style puzzle game that it was the first time around.
Gotcha.
If you don't abuse it, the game is not super easy, and it plays really well. I mean, there's like if you actually just talk about the gameplay, the mechanics are great. Like Metal Gear Solid 2 was a solid, no pun intended, or I don't know, whatever. Pun intended. Let's just go with that. It's a really great engine, so it just feels really fun to play. Where people kind of, I think, got a little bit frustrated is they re-recorded the voiceover. They changed the soundtrack. They added new cutscenes where there's this one, I don't even remember it in the game, but people always say, oh, it's got Snake flipping over rockets. He never did stuff like that. It's too ridiculous for Metal Gear, which, first of all, have you guys been here the entire time? This is totally not too ridiculous for Metal Gear. And second of all, I kind of get it. People had become really attached. The Solid, the first one, was a smash hit.
Right.
It was the thing that put the series on the map for a lot of people. So I can see messing with it as being kind of a blasphemy. But I mean, it's a solid game. Like if you have a copy of it, if you haven't played it, or you can find a copy of it, it's a totally solid, great game to play. I keep saying solid, but yeah, it's really, really good.
It sounds to me like the people who may have been introduced to this series with this game would have had a much more positive experience because it wasn't so because they didn't have anything to compare it to originally. And it's still, as you say, quote unquote, a very solid game. And I understand that a lot of times you've only hired the actors on, and they're only contracted for, that one piece of media because it's licensing or whatever it is. But, at the same time, it's like maybe you can work around that because it's just, I've never had a positive experience with re-recording with different actors. But,
This one is a bit of a weird story, actually. It's not... They did actually hire a few different voice actors, but what was the case, I think, this is the story I've heard, the original Metal Gear Solid was recorded essentially in a closet. Like, if you listen to the dialogue for the voiceover for the codec conversations, they're just really noisy, like really bad recordings acoustically. People definitely got attached to it, but they were like, we can't release a game on the next generation of systems with that crappy audio. We have to re-record it, otherwise it's just going to sound like we have these nice visuals, this nice high resolution music, and we have like audio that sounds like it was recorded in a closet. No, we can't do that. So some of it they had some creative differences. Like Mei Ling in the first game had sort of an offensive accent, and I think they got rid of it in Twin Snakes, and people get attached. So it's like there's like creative choices, but there was also just certain lines sounded different. So it was kind of out of necessity, but I think there was a lot of... I actually don't know how involved Kojima was in this particular re-release. This kind of the theme that I've noticed. When he steps away, you'll have these like really well-made games that are very competent that just feel like they're not paint by the numbers, but maybe a little bit more safe in terms of how much they feel like they're able to accomplish. So it's a tight package, but it's not like an exceptional one. Kind of like the first game we talked about, Snake's Revenge.
So you'd say it's not solid?
I don't know. I would say I would say that it's solid-ish.
Ah, yes. Maybe it lacks substance?
You could say that. You could say... I've been talking about this for a little while now, Ed. You pretty much are an expert on the Metal Gear series, right?
Oh, yeah, I live and breathe it.
Well, I think it's time, listeners, we take a trip down to the quiz alley. We're going to ask Ed several Metal Gear questions.
All right. I've been dreading this all day.
So I made them hopefully deducible via, process of elimination.
Okay.
I tried to make the questions not like rely on weird trivia, but I also made sure to highlight some of the weird trivia that the Metal Gear series is known for, so that even the wrong answers are so ridiculous, they could be the right answer.
Fair enough. Okay, so my expectations of myself are so low in this that I think any right answer will be a victory in my book. So I am ready, I am pumped.
Correct. So let's go over the rules. They're very simple. You get a code name awarded to you at the end of this quiz. If you get 0 questions right out of 4, you get the code name Johnny. Johnny, if you don't know, folks, is the character who spends most of his time in the bathroom with IBS or some similar affliction. So you don't want to be Johnny.
No.
At 1 point, you get the rating of Punished Snake. A disappointment, but still, you are a snake. At 2 points, you get Liquid Snake. Definitely some quality upgrades there. At 3, you get Solid Snake. And at a perfect 4 out of 4, you get the title of Big Boss.
Okay. And so I know what I'm aiming for, at least.
Correct. Obviously, we all want to be Big Boss, but we don't all achieve it in this lifetime.
Yes. I would settle for Solid Snake.
All right, so...
Here we go. Snake! Question?
Your goal is to find the fake snake. Which of these is not used as a snake codename in the Metal Gear series? We have A, Old Snake, B, Solidus Snake, C, Cold Snake, or D, Naked Snake.
Okay. Most of those sound vaguely familiar to me, except for Cold Snake. So I'm going to choose that one.
You are correct.
Yes! Okay.
We are 1 for 1. See, I wanted to give you an easy question to start.
All right, so I'm out of Johnny territory. That's all I was hoping for at this point.
Excellent. I knew you could do it. Cold Snake will make a return later in the episode, folks. Don't you worry. Now, question number 2.
Question.
Which of these is not a boss in a Metal Gear game? Now, these are just descriptions.
Okay.
And they're all silly, but they're all, except for one, real.
Okay.
So, we have A, a fire-breathing wrestler. B, a fat roller skating bomb expert. C, a 100-year-old photosynthetic sniper. Or D, a football-playing U.S. senator with metallic colossus skin.
These all sound so Kojima, it's not even funny.
It was hard to come up with a fake answer for this one.
I commend you for making a fake one that blends right in with everything else. Let's see here.
Do you need me to go back over them again?
Let's see. We got a fire-breathing wrestler, a 100-year-old photosynthetic sniper,
Correct, yes.
a U.S. senator with metallic skin. What was the fourth one?
A fat roller skating bomb expert.
Fat roller skating bomb expert. Okay. Man, the sniper sounds familiar to me, so I'm going to eliminate that one. Let's see, the other three, it could be...
It's a tough one.
33% of each one. So I'm going to have to kind of pick one at random and go with my gut feeling here. So I'm going to go with the roller skating bomb expert.
Unfortunately, Ed, that is incorrect.
I figured as much.
Metal Gear Solid 2 features Fat Man, who is a formerly bomb disposal expert who then plants bombs for you to disarm, and he taunts you the entire time.
I see.
The fake answer was a fire-breathing wrestler. I don't believe there was any fire-breathing characters in the series, although I tried my best to check to make sure that that was the case.
You know?
That's okay. That was a tough one.
Okay. I'm still in the running here, so I'm
You are.
feeling good.
You're doing all right. You're doing all right. And just to be, just to give a little bit more detail, we have a few other bosses I'd like to mention. In Metal Gear Solid 3, we have my personal favorite, Yevgeny Volgin. That's my name. Well, not the last name anyway, but he's an electrokinetic Russian colonel, so he shoots lightning bolts at you. You have a cyborg ninja and a parasite-enhanced commander named Skullface, who looks like Red Skull. All real bosses, all ridiculous. So,
What terrible parents to name your kids Skullface. Jesus.
I think he picked his own code name on that one. But still not a very inspired one, I have to say.
Yeah.
Question number 3.
Have at you, Snake. Question.
What can you not eat in Metal Gear Solid 3? So what can you not eat? The other 3 things are edible, although they are not advisable necessarily.
Okay.
We have A, Japanese folkloric snake. B, a hornet's nest. C, a guard dog. Or D, a poison dart frog.
Man. Welp.
Don't let your mind be fooled by the illusions, Ed.
Yeah. Was that a hint? It sounds like a hint.
Well, it depends. No, don't take anything I say too literally. I'm just saying,
Okay.
use your key and focus the energy. Think about what the real answer is.
Because I know poison dart frogs can cause illusions and hallucinations. But at the same time, I would think that eating a hornet's nest would be extremely difficult.
You could be right. You could also be wrong.
I could be right. The thought of eating a guard dog kind of breaks my heart a little bit, because hornets I want to see dead, but dogs, they're just trying to please their owners. And then what was the first one again?
A Japanese folkloric snake.
Japanese folkloric snake. Well, the game is called Snake Eater, is it not?
It is indeed.
Although you could have thrown that in there just to throw me off.
I could. Did you see the illusions here, Ed? They're piling up.
Yes, they are. There are reasons for and against every answer. Okay. I'm going with my gut, and I'm gonna say the hornet's nest.
Ed, you are incorrect. I'm sorry. You can actually break open the hornet's nest and eat its delicious honey, I guess.
Today I learned hornets make honey?
Or something. I think you're actually eating the nest itself. I never really looked too closely into it.
Wow.
The correct answer, thankfully, and you went there, but you went back, was the guard dog. You can attack them. You cannot eat them, thankfully.
Okay. That makes me feel better, though.
Yes, me too. You can eat the poisonous dart frog, and it has predictable results. It makes you very sick. It's not recommended. It's really more of an item you use on enemies. You can throw it at them and make them ill or distract them or what have you.
Gotcha.
And you can actually eat a Japanese folkloric snake called the Tsuchinoko. Let me tell you a little bit about those.
Sure.
Because I, prior to this, had never bothered looking it up. The Tsuchinoko is a Japanese mythical snake described as being between 12 and 31 inches in length, similar in appearance to snake, but with a central girth that is much wider than its head or tail, and as having fangs and venom similar to that of a viper. Some accounts also describe the Tsuchinoko as being able to jump up to 3 feet in distance, followed immediately by a second jump while still in the air. According to legend, some Tsuchinoko have the ability to speak and a propensity for lying, and they are also said to have a taste for alcohol. Legends say that it will sometimes swallow its own tail so that it can roll like a wheel, similar to the American hoop snake legend.
This is an amazing snake.
Yes, and because this is Kojima, you can lay a trap in one very specific spot, which is one of these, you would only know it if you had a guide or had somebody who told you. You lay a trap, and it captures this weird thing that suddenly becomes visible, but there's almost no other way to know that it exists except for this really weird kind of Japanese meta hidden item quest thing. But yes, you can in fact capture it. It is not recommended to eat because if you keep it, you get a bonus at the end for your New Game Plus. So
Oh, cool.
yeah.
I mean, I would want to keep a drunk, trolling, double jumping, talking hoop snake with me at all times anyway. I mean, that just sounds like a cool party trick. So
Yeah, if only they were real. That seems like a real fun person to keep around, a cool snake to keep around. I would definitely have one as a friend.
yeah, I mean, it sounds like something out of a Jendi Tartakovsky cartoon or something.
All right, are you ready for your final question, Ed?
All right, let's see if I can get into at least liquid snake territory. Let's go.
All right, you got one more chance. So,
Question.
which of these is not used as a weapon in the Metal Gear series? A rifle that shoots tornadoes, a psychokinetic voodoo doll, a hairspray and lighter combo, or a gun that fires explosive snake-shaped bullets.
Okay.
3 of those are real weapons that get used in the game.
Okay. Let's see here. So,
Or can be acquired. Some of them are bonus items, but still.
yeah, I seem to remember reading, like, in a Game Informer article or something about the hairspray and lighter combo. Might not have been from a Metal Gear game, though. It is a weapon in some game.
Sure.
But I'm gonna eliminate that just because it sounds familiar. A rifle that shoots tornadoes, a gun that fires snake-shaped bullets. What was the third one?
A psychokinetic voodoo doll.
Psychokinetic voodoo doll. So are these weapons that Snake uses, or just weapons that can appear that a boss uses or that Snake uses?
These are all just ones that Snake uses. Actually, one of them is one that a boss uses, but that's sort of immaterial to the question.
I see. Okay.
There's no shame in getting it wrong, Ed. These are all ridiculous questions.
Yeah, no, I know, but I've got my reputation on the line. I don't know what reputation that is, but it is a reputation. My gut says that it is the rifle that shoots tornado. No, I want to go back on that. Hold on.
That's okay. Take your time.
The psychokinetic voodoo doll. I don't know. That sounds like something Psycho Mantis would use, even though I don't remember him using that. That's one of the only bosses I do remember my brother playing when I watched him play Metal Gear Solid. Oh, Gene, you're killing me here. All right, so let's see. Let's go with final answer, a rifle that shoots tornadoes.
Ed, I'm afraid that is incorrect.
I figured. Damn it.
You actually get that weapon in multiple Metal Gear Solid games. In 4 and in Peace Walker, it's used to kidnap soldiers in Peace Walker. It is another Japanese folkloric weapon, the Tanagashima. So in the games, it has a percentage chance of summoning a tornado. The incorrect answer is actually a gun that fires snake-shaped bullets.
Okay.
I was hoping that'd be a little bit wink-wink and maybe a little bit too obvious, but no, I guess not. You can guess what era the hairspray and lighter combo is. That was from Snake's Revenge. Or sorry, Metal Gear 2. You get to use that as you are defenseless against the last boss, and you have to quickly run around the stage trying to find the materials to put together an improvised weapon.
Gotcha. Yes. Okay, I do remember at least seeing video footage of that, so I knew I had seen it in the game somewhere. So at least I'm glad I was able to eliminate one that was correct. Man, so what does that leave me?
Well, you made it out of Johnny territory. You are now at a score of 1 out of 4. Punished Snake, which he accomplished great things, I'm not going to lie. That is the protagonist of Metal Gear Solid 5. So, it's not your best score on a quiz on this show, Ed, but it's an admirable attempt. At least you didn't get a Johnny.
Yes, which is good, because I've heard enough about Johnny to know that he's not one person that I'd want to be. Gene, I do commend you for coming up with some extremely entertaining and very difficult to guess questions. That was actually a lot of fun. So maybe next time you're on the show, I'll have a quiz for you. I like returning the favor whenever anybody stumps me on one. So
I will step up to that challenge.
Awesome. And we got to learn a little bit more about the series and some of the quirkier parts of it as well. So that's really cool.
Before we close this out, hold on. I have 2 more quick things I wanted to mention.
Go for it.
There were a few unusual weapons I wanted to mention. In Metal Gear Solid 4, you can use the solar gun from Boktai, a little crossover there, another Kojima game. And my personal favorite, I am not making this up, in Peace Walker, you can farm for the ingredients or equipment for a giant human slingshot. It was so ridiculous, I didn't want to put it in as one of the answers.
That's incredible. I would probably have eliminated that right away.
It is 3 people holding a post and 1 person sits in the band and they get fired off into enemies. Completely impractical in an actual situation, but incredibly hilarious to assemble.
Fantastic. Now I got to see footage of that one. Cool. All right, so with that said, let's move on to our next track. Gene, what do we got coming up?
With that, we enter the next era of Metal Gear. This is BRC from Metal Gear Acid on the PSP, composed by Shuichi Kobori.
Cool. We'll be right back. And that was BRC from Metal Gear Acid that came out on the PSP in 2004, composed by Shuichi Kobori, Nobuku Toda, and Akihiro Honda. I think this might be my favorite of the show so far. It's extremely genre defying. Like I heard like a little bit of hip hop and a little bit of rock and a little bit of jazz and a little bit of funk and a little bit of dance. It's like just every instrument, every line has like a different genre assigned to it, and they all just kind of blend really well together. It was really fun to listen to.
Yeah, this was another way for me to get around the limitation of not playing more music from Metal Gear Solid 2.
Nice.
Because it sort of builds off of the work that was done by Norihiko Hibino, but it goes in a bit of a darker, crunchier direction. It's sort of an offshoot in a lot of ways. I mean, which fits with the series. This is kind of a sub-series, first for the PSP, new director. It's not one of the main games, so you kind of take those familiar themes and build on them, add a little bit more of your own take on it, which is why I really like this track in particular.
Gotcha. Yeah, I feel like if Hibino had composed something like this, you'd just replace the guitars with saxophone, and you'd have a decent Hibino piece.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and as I was saying, it is sort of very similar to a lot of the indoor themes that he had in Solid 2, but the rest of the soundtrack is a lot more, I don't want to say techno, but a lot heavier, a lot more mechanical, a lot more digital, I guess you would say.
Okay.
So it's a really cool soundtrack, but this one, I wanted to pick a more down-tempo piece that also has a lot going on in it, so I really like this one. Early PSP games have some of the same issues as early PlayStation games, kind of, the 3D models are kind of flopping around a little bit. Later games definitely fixed it, but including the second one, actually, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but it is based on the Metal Gear Solid side story kind of thing. You still play as Snake, Solid Snake, and you're running around buildings, a lot of indoor areas. So in that sense, I think it does match. It is very technological in that way. You're kind of more of the traditional setting, if you will.
Yep. I think you summed up the PS1 and early PSP era perfectly with 3D models flopping around a little bit.
Yeah, I was trying to play Vagrant Story the other day, or a few months back, and I remember thinking, even though this looks really good, it still has that kind of, these models have no backbone, flopping around kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. So this one, I feel like it kind of takes the attitude of the VR missions in a way and kind of applies it to a more realistic setting in a sense. But it's got more of a turn-based, so it's playing with the world in a way that the normal canonical series wouldn't, but it's got more of the strategy involved from the regular game. I mean, not that the regular game was turn-based, but...
No, I know what you mean. Yeah. It's actually kind of this is such a strange departure, and I think I mentioned this before we left. This is kind of the start of a new era of Metal Gear. Like, you'll notice almost everything up to this point has been remakes, expansions, sort of little small side games that are more or less the same thing. You play as Snake, you go in, procure your weapons, or similar, you kind of have one man versus a sneaking mission. And they were starting to break out of that a little bit with Metal Gear Solid 3, which is in a jungle. Now it's like, well, what about if we expand that idea to a completely different genre altogether? So this is a turn-based collectible card game RPG thing that takes place in the Metal Gear setting. It's very unusual, but it's pretty fun, actually. I played through maybe 5 or 6 hours of it, which I did enjoy, but there are some quality of life improvements that the second one has that this one doesn't, which make it a little bit frustrating, which is why I never finished it.
Yeah, I remember when this game was first announced. Not that I was very much into the Metal Gear series to begin with, but like I said, in the original volume, I did watch my brother play through the original Metal Gear Solid game on the PSX, and I was very interested to see what a Metal Gear game would look like on the PSP, and so seeing this game kind of like disappointed me a bit, because it's not that action game that I was expecting that I'd be able to like carry around with me. So, and I think that was, from what I remember, the reviews at the time were very much like people were trying to get over their disappointment that it wasn't a traditional Metal Gear Solid game and trying to review it for the game it is. But a lot of reviewers were having a very hard time in scoring at lower marks because of the disappointment in that it's a card game and not an action game. So you have to kind of separate yourself from your expectations. I guess, going 20, 30 years onward now from the game's release, it's easier to do that because you've known about it for a while. But at the time, I think it kind of struggled in the game review market because of its difference in genre to the original series.
And that's totally fair. I actually felt a little bit the same way. I was like, what is this? It's like you have all of these great, huge expectations from the series. It's gotten bigger and better. What is it going to be like on the PSP? And then they release this card game where you move your night move style squares across a grid, and you decide to use a card that represents a gun, and it has randomized damage, and sometimes it misses entirely, and it's like, what? If you kind of ignore the fact that it's in the Metal Gear setting, it's pretty much the same as a tactical strategy RPG in a weird sort of way. Yeah.
It's pretty neat. I think it feels a little bit like Advance Wars in a sense, with cards instead of moving on a grid. Same kind of deal. Or like the VAT system in Fallout, where when you're attacking someone, you can kind of pick the individual parts of a person. It'll tell you the percentage of whether it's going to hit or not. Like, it has all of those kind of elements kind of mixed into this kind of card game. So I guess if you have a really good imagination, you can kind of imagine the cards as, taking place as a real-time battle.
Definitely. And I will say, kind of referencing what I was saying earlier, while it is a fun game, there are a lot of annoying quality of life issues. Missions can be really long. If there's no checkpoints, you can lose 30 minutes to 45 minutes of progress. It can be already like a 20-hour game to begin with, so if you're playing sections over, it really...
On a handheld system, that's inexcusable.
Yeah, and the PSP had good battery life, but not amazing battery life, so... I can imagine you're down to like 25%. You've just failed a mission. It's like, all right, I'm going to put this down for a little while. So,
jeez.
I mean, I really appreciate, and I think for me, the biggest thing about the Metal Gear series, it isn't just let's merchandise, let's do everything. It is an opportunity for them to play with this rich setting and a lot of different gameplay styles and really explore in a way that I think very few game series get the opportunity to do. Japanese companies have been a little bit more hands-off with developers and saying, you do what you want to do. I know Kojima didn't direct this one, but he was a producer on it. He was still very involved. So he could say, let's run with it. Let's see where this thing goes. So I want to make a quick mention here before we move on. I actually kind of given a lot of this preamble because I also have the suspicion that Kojima had a lot of faith in the PSP. This is the first of 4 different games we're going to be talking about on the PSP, which is kind of a lot to bet on the system. There's Metal Gear Acid 1 and 2, then there's Portable Ops, and then finally Peace Walker. So a lot of really serious development of the series happened on the PSP. It was kind of a low-cost way to try out some of these ideas without the pressure of the huge Big Brother consoles. And to your point, people were a little bit disappointed when this game came out, but it still was successful enough to have a sequel, which is pretty cool.
Cool. All right, so you want to move on to our next track?
I do, but I want to actually go on a little bit of a subsection here. I think I also wanted to bring this up, which I think is really funny. Kojima is notorious for, air quotes, quitting the series. And I think a big reason why these games happened is because Kojima has sort of always been wanting to work on other projects. And we mentioned it before. He's now got Death Stranding, which is coming out, I think, probably a few weeks after this recording comes out. But here's a quote from September 28th, 2001. I really think that Metal Gear has to live on in some form, but as I said at the end of Metal Gear Solid, I really think it's time for me to hand the director role over to someone else. So that was in 2001. He's talking about quitting the series. Yeah. In March 10th, 2005, Metal Gear Solid 3 is the final chapter in the Metal Gear Solid series. Okay, and we go on in April 2nd of 2008. He says, I was supposed to end this in Metal Gear Solid 2, and then I created Metal Gear Solid 3. Okay, this is the final one. It's over. Of course, there were some questions that weren't answered, especially with 2. I decided that this timing, there was a lot of people saying, we want more answers. So, okay, now here we are wrapping up Metal Gear Solid 4. And then at the final quote I wanted to say, from March 4th, 2015, this ended up being the truth. I always say this will be my last Metal Gear, but the games in the series that I've personally designed and produced, Metal Gear on MSX, Metal Gear 2, Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, 3, 4, Peace Walker, and now Metal Gear Solid 5 are what constitute a single Metal Gear saga. With Metal Gear Solid 5, I'm finally closing the loop on that saga. And in that sense, this will be the final Metal Gear Solid Kojima continued. Even if the Metal Gear franchise continues, this is the last Metal Gear. And that did end up happening. There are more games, but he left the company. He's no longer involved with the series. But I thought it was funny that he's been saying the same thing for like 15 years.
It's true, and you know, considering how contentiously Kojima and Konami left off with each other, I almost wonder if Konami was like, dude, come on, you say this every time a new Metal Gear comes out. And they were trying to call his bluff, and Kojima was like, no, I'm dead serious. It's like the boy who cried wolf, and then there's finally a wolf, and so he ends up definitely leaving. But it's funny, I wonder what makes him come back, and I wonder what makes him want to leave. Like, he doesn't really list too much of his motivations, just more of what his decisions are in these interview clips. So I wonder if it's just getting bored of the series, or I wonder if it's not enough money. You know, there could be a million different reasons, but did he ever give any like real reasons when he left Konami? Like, why the final reason for leaving was?
I think part of it was Konami was shifting the budgets away from these huge productions. I know Metal Gear Solid 5 sold well, but it was also a really big gamble, and I think they were a little bit tired of those spend a lot, make a lot, so they kind of started moving to ports and kind of easier
pachinko
bets.
Games.
Yeah, pachinko games. And I also imagine that Kojima was finally hit that tipping point where it's like, okay, I've explored this universe of Metal Gear as much as I want. It is time to move on to a new project, a new universe, and go more for that breadth instead of that depth.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, almost 30 years of Metal Gear, like, I would be sick of Solid Snake.
Well, that's why he had all of these alternate storylines with the other snakes. But even still, there's a certain point where it's like the story has been told. In fact, the whole point of Metal Gear Solid 5 was to kind of end the series pretty much where the original Metal Gear Solid started. Sorry, where the original Metal Gear started, way back in like 1986, 1987. Your final mission is the one that has Solid Snake infiltrating the base where Big Boss is.
Yeah. God, what a finale.
Yeah, it was a whole long story behind that, but I think it's time we move on to our next track.
Absolutely, and I think the title to this track is actually quite fitting, considering our recent discussions. What do we got coming up?
This is Resurrection from Metal Gear Acid 2, released on the PSP in 2005 and composed by Akihiro Honda and arranged by Shuichi Kobori. All right, that was Resurrection from Metal Gear Acid 2, originally on the PSP in 2005 and composed by Akihiro Honda and arranged by Shuichi Kobori. What'd you think?
Well, this track suffers a little bit from multiple personality syndrome, but I really, really enjoyed the beginning. I mean, not that I didn't enjoy the more symphonic part at the end, but some really, really nice kind of dancey, almost drum and bass, like low frequency, oscillating synths coming in and out of the like background here and there. And I like that the composers finally realized that you're going to be listening to this on stereo headphones, and they had some really nice, like, wide panning stereo effects that obviously you wouldn't be getting if you were listening on the regular PSP speakers, but sound really, really good in headphones.
I totally agree. This is just a big track. Like, this is obviously intentional because this is the final boss, and even though this is a card game, want to take a wild guess what you're fighting in here, Ed?
A Metal Gear?
Metal Gear. Yes, of course. What else would it be, right?
Why couldn't that be a quiz question? See, I would have gotten that one.
You would have. I wanted to pick humanoid characters because those are the most ridiculous. But what I love about this track in particular is there's a version of it in the first game, and there's parts of it I like, but they took a second crack at it, much like the game itself, and I thought they really did a good job of making the parts a little bit more distinct. The choral parts are sort of big and triumphant, and there's that sort of tense energy of the repetitious synth parts that are kind of going in arpeggios, and there's just a lot of this tension between, am I going to make it? Am I going to defeat this thing? I think it just really works well to set the mood. There are some parts definitely that are a little bit schizophrenic, and it sort of goes back and forth, but in the context of gameplay, I can definitely see this working really well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard to envision hearing this music being played and then just playing a bunch of like cards in front of you. Like, they don't seem to jive with me. Like, this is definitely an action game song. So, I mean, and I understand that, you know, obviously you're not playing a game in real time, but I feel like this music would go a long way in cluing you into the importance and intensity of the battle that you're facing, even though, you know, what you're doing is pretty much the same thing you've been doing the entire game, which is just playing cards against a computer enemy.
That's fair, although one thing I didn't explain is when you play a card, the action does actually play out in front of you. So you have Snake on a grid. It's sort of that pseudo top-down thing from the original Metal Gear Solid. And then, so let's say you play a machine gun card, and he'll pick up the machine gun and start firing bullets. And Metal Gear plays the photon, whatever rocket cards, and rockets will launch at you. The 3D models of the rockets will, you know, hit your character, and you'll take damage. It is animated, but it is that, you're right, there is still that time-lapse gap, so it's not quite as punchy as it might be in an actual game, but you're still fighting against this gigantic Metal Gear. It's probably 10, 15 times bigger than you are.
Yeah. And on a positive note, that lapse in action also gives you a little bit more time to kind of sit back and enjoy the really good soundtrack as well. So there's pros and cons to it.
Definitely. The Acid 1 and 2 soundtracks are both crunchier, darker, a lot more drum and bass, sort of grittier electronic stuff. I think they're pretty dark compared to some of the main Metal Gear games, and they're definitely worth a listen. I think you can get both of them on one album. There's like an Acid 1 and 2 soundtrack, so they fit pretty well together. I actually prefer 2 a little bit more, but I think it's just a matter of they had kind of a sound they were going for, and they just had a chance to develop on it. And it's a shame there were no more games in the series, but it kind of is this self-contained little story here.
Yeah. Dark, gritty electronic music is right up my alley, so these are the soundtracks that I'll probably enjoy the most, I think.
Yeah, definitely check it out.
For sure. So, between the two, like, what are the major differences between Acid 1 and Acid 2?
So, Acid 2 features a little bit of a difference. It's got more of a cel-shaded look to it. It's got some nice quality of life improvements. Things like the randomization has been reduced, so it's not so random, like the kind where you fire at an enemy point blank and you do 0 damage. That kind of randomness, or you're sitting there with no useful cards in your deck and you're waiting 3 turns for an actual attack card to come up, that kind of randomness. Pointless things like, apparently, I hated this in the first game, opening doors, turning, those things used movement points, and those are precious. So you're in an area with a lot of doors, there's an enemy to your left, an enemy to your right. Do you attack the enemy to your right, which is stronger, or the left enemy, and then you waste turn, there's all of those things were fixed. I'll be honest, though, I only played the second one just a little bit because I was sort of a little bit frustrated still from the first game that I didn't really give it the time of day, but I've heard it's a really good game.
To me, the more you describe it, it almost sounds like fans of like the XCOM series might like this game.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Very cool. I know a couple people who are very much into that, so this might be a good portable option for them. Speaking of portable options, what do we have coming up next?
The next track is from Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops. So this one was released in 2006. This is the first real, air quotes, Metal Gear Solid game on the PSP. That's, an action-based game. This track is called Match, and it was composed by Takahiro Izutani.
Welcome back, Smooth Cats. That was Match from Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops for the PSP in 2006, composed by Takahiro Izutani, Norihiko Hibino, and Yoshitaka Suzuki. The song just makes me want to talk like this, like I've been smoking 15 packs of cigarettes a day.
It's a slick track, isn't it?
It is. It's really good. It starts off very jazzy, and then that kind of hip-hop, almost breakbeat comes in and turns into this really slick acid jazz track, and I was just grooving the whole way through it. Very different from the first two PSP soundtracks that we listened to, but I think equally as listenable. And so I'm interested in the, like, is this called Match because it's like you're in a match, like a waiting room for an online game or something like that?
I think it is, yeah. So the game, Portable Ops, both Portable Ops and Portable Ops Plus, which is sort of a expansion of the original, but with more emphasis on multiplayer. I think you can have sort of a drop-in thing where multiple people will join you, or you can play against each other in combat missions. There's been a whole slew of these Metal Gear Online things, which we don't even talk about during this show, but since I think Metal Gear Solid 3, they've had a lot of these online modes where you play against others, usually in like an arena mode where you have to tag the other person or attack them. You don't always have to do lethal damage, but it's that kind of thing. I think. Don't quote me on that. I only played the single player of Portable Ops. Okay, yeah, well, I mean, this would be a perfect track for a lounge that you're waiting for your compatriots to join in the fight with you, because it's not that kind of, because you can go one of two ways. You can go with either a very bombastic track that kind of builds you up and gets you ready for the fight, but that doesn't seem like Kojima's style. He seems like when there's a respite in action, regardless of whether it's pre-action or post-action, he always kind of like chooses or directs a very smooth kind of, he loves to add that very calming music in, and I think he likes that juxtaposition between having these really smooth kind of jazzy tunes and these really uplifting bombastic or electronic tunes, and that it's a really great kind of dichotomy between the two feels in all of his soundtracks. Definitely, and I think one of the things you picked up on is how different it is from the Acid 1 and 2 games, and that's because we are now back in the Big Boss series of games. Oh, okay. This game takes place in 1970 after the events of Snake Eater. The whole point of Portable Ops is kind of, Kojima really wanted to explore that transition from Big Boss as a naive and somewhat idealistic hero to somebody who's being wooed over to maybe less good causes, so fighting a little bit more independently. The game is kind of unusual in that way because the enemy that you end up fighting, his name is Gene, so another bad guy with my name in the Metal Gear series. Yeah. Funny coincidence, I noticed. But the whole thing is Big Boss is on his own. He's sort of been abandoned by the American government. The Russian government doesn't want anything to do with him. He sees this guy who's now the new leader of Fox, his old unit, who wants to start this independent military nation, which if you've played the Metal Gear series should sound pretty familiar. That's what Big Boss ends up doing. But he's still kind of in this weird middle ground, like, no, that's evil. That's wrong. I don't want to let this maniac do this kind of stuff. But what's really good is it has the whole kidnapping mechanic. So you collect characters and you start to build up a bit of an army of your own. And so there's this kind of very subtle both player and mechanical thing where, this idea of having a military, it's not such a bad thing. Like, I've got this whole army of people supporting this base and other characters I can play as, and they all have their own abilities, and I've got this really well-oiled machine. I'm really fond of this. It's a very gradual, subtle kind of thing. I really like that.
Yeah, it seems like he's not only demonstrating Big Boss's kind of comeuppance and coming around to that line of thinking, but also letting the player come around to that line of thinking too, because having those extra teammates is benefiting the player as well. So it's interesting how he's using that to kind of help you sympathize with Big Boss, even though chronologically, you're not going to be sympathizing with him later on in the Metal Gear series.
Oh, definitely. And I just want to give a little bit of a background on the game sort of in the broader sense. You have to remember this was a PSP game in 2006, so it's actually kind of a hard one to go back to. The gameplay is not so great anymore. It's a little bit clunky. The maps are a little bit small. But think about how ambitious this was. You have these essentially wide open maps where you have soldiers who you can now recruit as you're playing. There's these larger mission-based structures where you can play different areas. It's a kind of a non-linear game, to be perfectly honest. It's very different in terms of the structure. You have the base management mechanics. You have the switching to different characters. I don't think this would have gone over very well if this had been on the PS2 or even the PS3, because it was right around the corner. So again, going back to that, developing a new gameplay style that would have been a much harder sell on the big consoles and might not have been very successful because they were working out a lot of kinks here. In fact, I would say this game is entirely redundant at this point.
Yeah, a lot of these gameplay elements that you're talking about sound very familiar from the end of our Volume 1 episode.
Yeah, this is the game that launched that entire base mechanic, Peace Walker, Metal Gear Solid 5 style of gameplay.
Yeah.
And I don't think it would have been possible if they hadn't had the growing pains of learning what worked and what didn't work. It's such a clunky game. Kidnapping characters can take like 2 or 3 minutes at a time.
Wow.
Later games, they have a little bit more quality of life. Like you can just throw them on a balloon and they get kidnapped right there. But the whole point is, again, kind of like the original one that we talked about in the show, Snake's Revenge. I think we owe a lot of the series to this game and the desire to try again, to experiment, something that a lot of game series don't get. If something's a failure or if it's just kind of too weird, they shelve it and never try it again. So big props to Portable Ops for that, at least.
Yeah, it's nice having it's almost like a public game design laboratory. And I'm sure when they released it, they were not going to be expecting 100% high praise all around, because it really seems like they were developing this concept to begin with. So, because a lot of these game developers that go on these big series kind of almost start listening only to themselves and really just not taking a lot of fan feedback into account and just kind of doing whatever they want to do. But Kojima seems to be a little more apt to take that feedback and integrate it into later versions of games, which is why I think he's so beloved. So I think this game is a really good example of taking that kind of gameplay, really refining it, and then introducing it on a much bigger budget title later on.
Totally. Kojima did not direct this game, but I think he saw enough potential here that he took a really hands-on approach for Peace Walker, which is sort of the next game in the series, and then eventually Metal Gear Solid 5. So I don't think he would have gone down this path if his other director hadn't had this idea for a new style. So that's super cool. And I think, like, to your point, that level of humility is really rare when you're at the level that he is. Like, he's a name in the game industry. People can point to Kojima as an individual. And as many people are involved in games as there are, just in one game, that's a lot of power.
Yeah.
So I really respect that ability to have that vision, but also to be able to listen to the people that are working for you.
The people working for you and the fans and just the world in general. So it's a lot of pressure. I can understand why he keeps wanting to quit, you know? I can imagine that being very overwhelming for anyone, never mind a big-time game director. So I'm impressed that he was able to go that long, releasing so many big titles to so much acclaim over and over again.
Definitely. Now, I wanted to ask you, Ed, are you feeling a little cold over there? I'm feeling a bit of a wind chill.
You know, it's been really windy and rainy, and I've been hearing, like, bells overhead. I'm not sure what's going on. It's really strange.
Yeah, is it? I'm feeling a bit of that holiday spirit. I'm usually a bit of a Grinch, but I think it's time we get on to our next track. Ed, do you want to bring us in, or should I?
I think I'll bring us in. So we're going to go a little off the rails. So I think we mentioned at the beginning of the show that there might be a few games in here, or at least one game that Konami didn't necessarily release on their own. And so this is a fan game called Merry Gear Solid 2 Ghosts of Christmas Past. And this was released on Windows in 2009. This is a track called He Sees You When You're Sneaking, aka Encounter 1, composed by Kazuki Muraoka and arranged by Gordon McNeil. And I'm very interested in hearing more about this game when we come back.
That was He Sees You When You're Sneaking from Merry Gear Solid 2 Ghosts of Christmas Past. Composed by Kazuki Muraoka and arranged by Gordon McNeil. I love bringing this stupid soundtrack and game up. I brought it up about a year ago on our last holiday show on Pixelated Audio. This is a different track, but the same general theme.
This is fun as hell. You know, it starts off, you're like, oh, it's like the introduction to like some sort of Lifetime Christmas movie, and then you start hearing the sneaking theme from the original Metal Gear Solid game come in, and you're like, wow, it blends them so well. I was really impressed by like how they went back and forth between the two, like the Christmas theme and the Metal Gear themes. Really, really well done. Plus, you know, you got to have that quintessential sleigh bell off in the right channel there, just kind of shaking away and giving you that really kind of like merry kind of feel.
It's one of those things where leave it to the fans to create something like this, because why not mix Christmas music with Metal Gear, right?
Sure. It's a no-brainer, right?
Other notable tracks from the album are Do Not Push Start Till Christmas. The Very Next Day You Gave My Position Away.
Nice.
And Merry Gear.
It's hard to say with a straight face.
Yeah. Sneaking is Believing is another one.
Mm-hmm.
So to give a little bit of story on this one, there was a game called Merry Gear Solid Secret Santa, released in 2006. Similar thing, released as a parody fan game for the Christmas season. And that one is a very, very simplistic game, almost to the level of like a Flash game. But people were so fond of it that the original creator, Arthur Lee, or Arthur Podunkian Lee, he decided to make a sequel to it and expand on it greatly. So this one is kind of like if you took Metal Gear Solid 4 and added Snake as Santa Claus. Shopping through a mall and knocking out naughty children and trying to find the ghosts of Christmas past. So like Jack Frost. It's just super silly and overwrought in exactly the way that a Metal Gear game should be.
That's awesome. Very, very cool. I see in your notes that Arthur Lee also did Streamers on the NES, which is a really, really fun homebrew NES game that you can play in a real console. And it's kind of like Bionic Commando, except you're like shooting like party streamers at the ceiling to kind of like move your way through increasingly more difficult areas. And it's got the quality of a regular NES game. Like, this guy is a really good developer, and to make fan games like this is just icing on the cake.
Yeah, and there's a bonus mode which plays just like VVV, where you flip the gravity up and down. That's a really fun mode. You play through the exact same game, but I'm actually surprised there hasn't been more exploration of this, because I was really fond of this game. Streamers is great. You should try it. It's playable on browser as well.
Oh, cool.
So, if you don't mind, Ed, I'd like to read a quick excerpt from the Metal Gear Solid 2 story.
Oh, I am waiting with bated breath.
"3 years after the Secret Santa incident, Christmas has never been the same. The number of PNC, or Pretty Naughty Children, has increased over the years, and the SOC, Spirit of Christmas system, is out of balance due to the untimely assassination of Saint Nick. On Christmas Eve, Cold Snake infiltrates Outer Savin Mall to stop the ghosts of Christmas past from gaining full control over the SOC system and throwing the world into perpetual naughtiness."
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's basically told exactly like that in the game. They have a guy who sounds like a fake Snake and a fake Otacon who's like, "Snake, you just found this thing that knocks out naughty children."
That's great. Oh, man.
Yeah, you get a weapon called the Novocaine, which I don't know why you actually body slam the children, but it's supposed to be like a candy cane. And there's a deer mask that you use to camouflage yourself against the walls, so you just press up against it and walk, kind of.
That's incredible. I got to watch some YouTube footage of this. I kind of like. I knew of it when you put it on the list for the show, but I kind of wanted to avoid any footage until we discussed it, because I felt it was going to make me want to play it even more. So this is a free download you can get on the web?
That's right, yeah. It's Windows only, unfortunately, but there are fun playthroughs to watch. It's about 2 or 3 hours, so if you don't have a Windows machine or can't play it, you can watch one of the many playthroughs where people go through it. There's ridiculous cutscenes up the wazoo. There's even a scene of like a 3-minute explanation for why you have a tranquilizer gun for no reason. They talk about how the characters were trying to take over Santa's laboratory and it resulted in failure, and that's why we have this prototype gun.
Gotcha.
So I don't want to talk about this too much more, but I will say that for those of you who like Christmas movies, it would be good to know that Kurt Russell made a movie in 2018 called The Christmas Chronicles. So Solid Snake does play Santa. So this is all canon, by the way.
Of course. Of course. So everything kind of meets, it's like a big Ouroboros. It's just a snake eating its own tail.
It's a hoop snake, you could say. All right, let's move on to our next track, shall we?
Absolutely. All right, coming up next is a track called Gear Rex, and this is from Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. This originally released on the PSP in 2010, but came out a year later on the Xbox and PS3. This was composed by Kazuma Jinouchi, and other composers on the soundtrack are Akihiro Honda, Nobuku Toda, Shuichi Kobori, and Seihiro Hirose.
All right, that was Gear Rex from Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, originally on the PSP in 2010 and composed by Kazuma Janucci, with other composers Akihiro Honda, Nobuko Toda, Shuichi Kobori, and Seiro Hirose. I'm a big fan of this track. Ed, what do you think?
Yeah, I like the really strong backbeat, the solid da-da-dum, bump, bump, da-da-dum. Like, it has a really good kind of, almost like a four-on-the-floor rock beat feel during most of the A sections, so I really kind of enjoy that stuff. I tend not to like free-form symphonic music. I really appreciate it more when it has a nice beat to it, so that really kept me kind of in the loop and going with the flow with this track. Other than that, I felt it had a very cinematic feel, very suspenseful, not necessarily like a huge combat scene, but it felt more like you were being pursued by something or hiding out from something that was kind of, peeking through the trees and around buildings and trying to like find out where you are. Is that the kind of tone that it has in this game?
It's actually during a boss fight. I'll sort of explain that in a little bit, but what I really like about this track is Peace Walker in particular is really good about having these big bombastic orchestral style scores, and particularly combat, because you're spending a huge amount of your time fighting these large boss battles. Tanks and planes and cargo vehicles. You also fight these AI pods, and you're also fighting, in this case, Metal Gear Rex, which is a dinosaur that looks a little bit like Metal Gear and fires lasers from its head. Go figure.
Sounds fun.
But the boss themes are definitely some of my favorite in Peace Walker, and I wanted to bring this one up because part of why I really like the Metal Gear games is because of the memories that I have of them. And while Peace Walker is a main series game, and we're talking more about these sort of offshoot games, they take place during these optional Monster Hunter missions. So you start off, you're playing the game. If you get a hint from someplace, which is usually from your friend Chico, who is a budding cryptozoologist, he's constantly talking to Big Boss about various dragons and monsters and all of this stuff. And Snake is listening in earnest. He's like, "Oh, that's unbelievable. Where is it?" And so he starts to buy into it a little bit, and it sounds like, okay, whatever, this is stupid and ridiculous. And then it turns out to be one of these kinds of things that 20 years ago would have felt like something you told your friends on the schoolyard, and turns out to actually be true. Like, no, if you go to the beach during the daylight, there's a boat there, and then there's a cat who will take you to an island full of monsters. So you kick off these series of 8 missions where you fight a total of 3 different monsters from the Monster Hunter series. And Gear Rex is a original. He's unique to the Metal Gear games, and you fight him 3 times. Each time he gets harder. The last mission, this guy can really wreck your stuff, so be careful. It's one of those tracks that kind of imprinted on my mind, because the first one and the second one are kind of a joke, but the third one, you need 3 or 4 people or super awesome gear to stand a chance against this guy. One hit, he's knocked out all of your rations.
Wow.
You're very close to death in just one laser blast or whatever it is, so it is very tense. You're listening to this, and every time those triplets come back, you're like, Metal Gear Rex is right around the corner. He's going to blast me.
That's awesome. So these are all kind of like optional missions within the Peace Walker game?
Yeah. So there's 120 main extra ops. So there's kind of broken up into 2 sections. You have your main ops, which are the story missions. Those you'll usually have cutscenes. And then you have extra ops, which kind of are the stand-in here for the VR missions, I guess.
Okay.
They aren't VR because this is the 1970s. There's no such concept as VR, but there are all these ridiculous missions like fire at a bunch of drones or shoot people down from balloons. And these are even extra crazy, weird bonus missions where you fight Monster Hunter monsters.
That's cool.
And in a party, or you can fight them in a party. So that's why I brought this track in. That's
cool. That's really fun. I mean, this sounds like a lot of content to pack into a PSP game. Was the PSP game more stripped down, or were the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions pretty much faithful ports?
Almost identical. I think
That's
the
cool.
only thing that they changed for the 360 and PS3 version was upscaled HD graphics, maybe slight remaster on the audio. I don't even think they did, because the PSP had pretty good internals. So
Yeah.
I actually don't know that they did all that much, really. I was hooked. When I played this, I didn't even know that it came out on PSP. I was like, oh, cool, the Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3 remakes are coming out, and what's this other game? Peace Walker? That sounds like fun. And I was hooked. I played through it 2 or 3 times all the way through with various friends. It's just so much fun.
Did Kojima produce this one or direct it?
He did, yeah. Like I was saying, he was so impressed with what they were going for. It's really crazy when you see a game that Kojima wasn't involved with, and it's like kind of got some good ideas, and he just knows how to push his development team to get the most out of it. Like,
yeah,
the maps are bigger, the story is better, the music is more dynamic and involving. It's basically Portable Ops on steroids. I mean, it was like 4 years later, but it's this huge game. And there are some little things, like the maps do feel a little bit small when you're playing on consoles because they were working on like a 333 megahertz portable console. So they were, they had to stash a lot in a small area. But they still feel really good. And you spend a lot of your time fighting these boss battles, so the short missions don't really bother you as much. They're meant to be that sort of pick up and play, and it still really works, especially if you play multiplayer, which I did a ton of. You might remember the story from the last one with the underpants.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm very impressed that he was able to make a game on the PSP that could be upscaled to the PS3 and the 360 without needing to add anything and still be considered a worthwhile, cutting edge at the time console purchase, especially since he's working on the same hardware that the original Portable Ops game ran on.
Yeah.
So that's just to your point. I mean, just what he almost was able to like double the capabilities of this system that other people I think this is probably one of the most advanced, technically impressive PSP games available for the system, like carte blanche.
Absolutely. And if you can get it on the Vita with the second stick, it becomes so much better to play. The PSP version's a little bit funky that way. It's still really fun, but if you're able to download a copy from the PlayStation Store, because it's still a PSP game, but with that extra stick, you just map it to like camera controls, and it is like playing on the main consoles. It's a really, really, really fun game. I love this one. It's probably my favorite in the series, sort of just in terms of my fondness of that second half where it's more of the base building. And in fact, Kojima even called this Metal Gear Solid 5 originally.
Okay, cool.
It was kind of what he envisioned as the next story game in the series.
Very cool. So that's kind of wrapping up our Snake saga as far as the episode goes, right?
Pretty much, yeah. I did want to bring up a few honorable mentions. We're not going to play any of this stuff, but I do want to talk about some other Metal Gear Solid media. So I would be remiss not to mention the Beatmania remix, where you can play the Metal Gear Solid theme song. That was back in 98. Snake appeared in Smash Brothers Brawl for the Wii.
Mm-hmm.
There was a Metal Gear Solid mobile game, Metal Gear Solid Touch. He was also in Little Big Planet. There was a level builder kit where they had...
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Art. So you have these little Sackboy characters using the art from the Metal Gear games. So they have like bandanas and they're running around looking like Snake. It's really adorable. It's kind of silly, but There's also Metal Gear Solid Social Ops, which was... A lot of these were more mobile games, portable games, but mobile phones, so not really that big of an investment. In fact, they either reused music or the music was so bad it wasn't worth talking about, so I just kind of skipped all of this. There's a bit of an exception with Smash Brothers Brawl. He did also appear in the most recent one that came out, Smash Brothers Ultimate.
Right.
So, but I just wanted to bring up these other side games because I wanted to talk about the ultimate side game next, and we're going to be playing a track from it. This is A Stranger I Remain. This is sort of a mini mix that I had to put together so that you could hear various different parts. It's a little bit different from what you might hear in the game, but this is from Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance for the PS3 and 360, and later the PC, Mac, Android. It was composed by Logan Mader and Jamie Christopherson, with vocals by Free Dominguez and remixed by Maniac Agenda.
All right, let's hit it. All right, everyone, wash that manic panic out of your hair and cancel all those Hot Topic credit cards. That was A Stranger I Remain, the Maniac Agenda mix from Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance that came out on the PS3, Xbox 360, PC, Mac, and Android in 2013, composed by Logan Mader and Jamie Christopherson, with vocals by Free Dominguez and remixed by the Maniac Agenda. Very different from everything we've listened to in the past two podcasts, but it's very fitting for this game. I mean, this game has a very action and cool and metal kind of feel to it. I really like that this track feels very new metal, but also has a lot of 2010s production value, a lot of really heavily edited guitars with some little dubstep and dance influence in there. Early new metal had a lot of hip-hop influence, like you were talking about, like Evanescence and Skindred and a whole bunch of those other bands out there that really kind of added hip-hop. But this has more of the dance music influence in with the metal, which almost gives it kind of an industrial feel. So I really kind of like that about this one.
Yeah, I normally wouldn't pick a track like this for my personal listening pleasure. I don't find myself drawn to new metal. I don't find myself generally drawn to vocal music in video games, but Metal Gear Rising is sort of the ultimate departure from Metal Gear. It's totally over the top. It was designed by Platinum Games. It was kind of like a light Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. Everything is amped up to the nth degree. Do you remember that boss I was telling you about that is Colossus Skin U.S. Senator that used to play football?
Yes.
That's this game.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
So, everything about this game is crazy. Raiden, the character from Metal Gear Solid 2, is now a cybernetic ninja. He was in Metal Gear Solid 4, but here you play as him. He's got all sorts of cybernetic enhancements. You have health bars and digital displays and scanning, and you can do crazy death from above moves where you stab somebody from a stealth kill. And the bosses are equally over the top. This is from the first boss, Mistral, who's kind of the first main stage boss. You have a couple before that who are kind of those opening stage, looks really impressive, but really not that hard to beat. All the main bosses, typical Platinum games, are humanoid, so they're kind of equal match to you. Devil May Cry did a lot of the same kind of thing. You know, the characters who are your biggest match are the ones who have a wide range of moves, and if you were to play as them, would be equally capable. And in many cases, you do, actually. So she is kind of I think Dr. Octopus with a spear, basically.
Okay.
So she controls these little droids that walk around, and they connect to her to make more arms for her to hold her spear while she attacks you, or attack you and then have the arms attack you. It's like, that's the least crazy boss in the game.
Well, it seems almost like it's designed so that you can use your sword to slice the arms off and just have a blast doing so.
Oh yeah, the whole game, the core gameplay concept is that you can go into this blade mode where time slows down and you can slash at things, and you use the stick to kind of do the direction so you can slash kind of in 360 degrees. And you have to find weak points a lot of times. Like one of the first moves she does is she'll fire a rope at you, and you have to slash the rope, which triggers the next sequence of the battle. So something you'll notice from the track that we played is that at about the halfway mark, it goes from kind of good core energy to suddenly there's these big swells, and the electronics are going a little crazy. This is a dynamic track in the game. So as you deplete a certain percentage of the boss's health, it goes into different modes. So it gets like bigger energy, then the vocals come in, and then there's that like thing at the very end where you're like kind of repeats a whole bunch.
Yeah.
That's when you're slashing at the boss like crazy, just like you're getting all the aggression out, like screw you, like I'm gonna finish you
just
off.
the big climax of the finale.
Yeah, every boss has that. There's like, I think usually about 3 or 4 phases to every boss, and then, you know, there's like that big explosion at the end where they fall to pieces and hit the ground. It's just so much.
It's so much. That's a perfect description for it. I remember seeing the original like tech demo and trailer for this game where I think Raiden was just like running around in an area that had like park benches and like watermelons and vegetables and stuff, and just he was slicing things, and like they were demonstrating that as the sword passed through these items on the level, that they didn't just like, you know, generically split in half. Like they would actually slice where you hit with your sword, so you could like dice things up and slice things in different angles. And it was just this really, really cool tech, and it had real physics, so they kind of fall realistically after you sliced them. So it just looked like a blast to play. Even just running around in an environment and kind of like chopping things to bits almost seemed fun in and of itself, never mind, you know, fighting enemies. So I don't know. I don't know why I didn't really end up playing this game, because I remember being pretty excited about it. Like, oh, here's something in the Metal Gear series that like actually fits a type of action game that I like, because I'm a really big Devil May Cry fan. So, the other question I wanted to ask was, so is this technically in canon, or did you pick this just because it's a side story not involving Snake?
I think this one is actually technically canon,
Okay.
but the main character is Raiden, and it's sort of around the time of Metal Gear Solid 4, paramilitary forces and that kind of thing. There's this funny scene in Metal Gear Solid 4 where you meet Raiden and he's like actually a badass, whereas he was kind of an annoying, whiny guy in Metal Gear Solid 2. So I think Kojima was really interested in exploring that. How did he get to be like this cool cyborg ninja that's doing all these crazy ninja moves? So, you know, it's funny. I actually have been putting this game off for the longest time. I knew I would like it, but it wasn't until I knew we were doing this show that I said, all right, I'll play the game. I'm sure it's fun. I had a blast with it. I wish I hadn't put it off for so long. It was so much fun.
Yeah, I still have my PS3 hooked up, so maybe I should grab a cheap copy from a used game store and give this one a try, because the more we talk about it, the more I'm like, oh, I really got to do this now.
Yeah, if there's any game from this list that you need to play, it's this one.
Yeah.
Like the other ones, novelty, cool, you know, but even if you aren't a Metal Gear fan, Metal Gear Rising is the creme de la creme. And actually, a funny thing about this one, kind of going back to what we said earlier, Kojima had the wherewithal to know when to hand it over. The original tech demo for this, they couldn't really get it to work as an action game because the Metal Gear engine is a little clumsy. Like by this point, they were starting to get the kinks out of it, and Metal Gear Solid 5 is a pretty smooth game, but it's not really an action game the way Devil May Cry or Bayonetta are. So they were like, look, we really want this thing to happen, and rather than kill the project, let's give it to Platinum. That's their bread and butter. Let's let them go nuts with it. And they totally did. And this is one of those games that even, like I said, non-Metal Gear fans will talk about. If you look it up, people will talk about just how over the top it is, how ridiculous and fun. And it's not that long of a game, too. So if you've got other time commitments, the stages can be a little long, but I think you can beat the game in about 8 hours. So it's not a big commitment.
Yeah, no, that's fairly standard. That's kind of what the Devil May Cry games are as well. So that's pretty cool.
Definitely.
Excellent. So I hate like ending on a more sour note, but unfortunately, the last game that we've had in the Metal Gear Solid series as of this recording is Metal Gear Survive, which was the final Metal Gear game after Kojima left Konami. And so we're going to listen to a track called A Parade of the Dead. This game came out on the Xbox One, PS4, and PC in 2018, and it was composed by Haruna Kubo, Takanori Kaneko, Pedro Avalar, and Karin Nakano. We'll be right back.
That was A Parade of the Dead from Metal Gear Survive, originally on Xbox One, PS4, and PC in 2018, composed by Karen Nakano, Haruna Kubo, Takanori Kaneko, and Pedro Avalar. I really like this track, but I have to admit I have some mixed feelings about this game and this soundtrack. This was a really hard one to pick. I wish I had more better tracks from this game, but we will get into that in a little bit. What did you think about this song?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned to you while we were listening to it, I do feel like they, at least with this track, they really captured the spirit of Metal Gear Solid. And we were also kind of talking that a lot of these names, or all of these names in this list of composers, are new to the series. So I think they really had to kind of dive deep into the original soundtracks and kind of pull out elements of Metal Gear sounds that they wanted to incorporate. And they did a lot of that with those kind of like little violin stabs, the really kind of fast-paced yet subdued percussion, and those little like electronic swirly sounds that go from speaker to speaker. Like all those elements have been in other Metal Gear games before, and that they're all kind of rehashed here in a way that sounds good, but it doesn't sound very inspired, or that doesn't really break any new ground. So I haven't heard the rest of the soundtrack for this, but if this is like what you've picked as an example of some of the best music in the soundtrack, then I'm probably not going to appreciate the rest of it too much.
Which is sort of the unfortunate thing about this one. I feel like this goes back to that whole Kojima's no longer involved in the series. They put together a really excellent team. The quality of the compositions is really great, but you're right, to that point, they're not super inspired. They're very technically competent, but not that really powerful, driving. It's to the point where a song like A Stranger I Remain really gets me pumped up, even though I don't love the genre.
Right.
Whereas this is very much more in the Metal Gear style, and I find like it was hard for me to even pick out a track to surface. But I do want to bring it up for a couple of reasons, because I think this is a game that, for some good reasons and some bad reasons, got a lot of bad press. So first of all, Kojima had left in a very public way from Konami. I think they were already moving away from these big budget games, as I mentioned, but he basically said, I'm out, goodbye, no more Metal Gear for me, you're on your own. The fans were not happy, and then suddenly Konami announced that there was another Metal Gear game happening. They knew for real that this was not going to be a Kojima game.
Right.
So the fans were livid. They're like, this is never going to be any good. This is terrible. It was this weird zombie apocalypse Metal Gear game with unrecognizable characters. And so it just looked like this lazy cash-in. And to be fair, that's not completely untrue. It's not the most inspired game in the series, but look at it from the perspective of the people who have just been handed this garbage fire.
Yeah.
They have to complete a game with the fans against them. No matter what they produce, it's going to get panned. And to be honest, I didn't even want to play this game. I was like, what about this game do I even want to try? And then it became free on Xbox Game Pass. So, like, if you have a membership, you can just download a game and try it out. I gave it a fair shake. I got most of the way through the game. I think I'm kind of stuck at the last major encounter before the main story is over. But I just didn't have the energy to do all the grinding necessary to kind of get me over the edge. So I had my fun with it. It's like a solid 7 out of 10 game. It's not bad, but it's definitely not the game Metal Gear Solid 5 is. I'll let you kind of respond because I don't want to cut you off too much, but I'll talk a little bit about the game after that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, basically just my own personal remembrances of this game was watching the trailer. I think it was maybe the 2017 E3 or wherever they originally released it. Mm-hmm. And even before I started seeing and reading all of the reactions on the web, I don't know, I kind of felt bad for Metal Gear fans watching this and how far removed it was. Like, I also could kind of empathize in a way, because being a really big Silent Hill fan and what they kind of did to the series at the end of that, there's a very big parallel. And even Kojima wanted to do a Silent Hill game with Konami, and that got ripped out from under everyone's feet. So I was kind of relating to Metal Gear fans on that level, in that here's a series that you've kind of grown up with and you feel so attached to, and it's just, you look back and you're like, oh, gradually they've just been watering it down so much, and pretty soon you're just, you've gone from this nice craft beer to basically Budweiser, and you're like, you didn't even realize you were holding it until it's just, until somebody throws it in your face and you're like, oh, this is terrible. I didn't like the way the game looked. Eddie, my oldest son, who's 14, he plays games like Rust and Fallout and games that were very much like this, and I even asked him about it. I was like, hey, did you see that new Metal Gear game? It looks like something you might like. And he watched the trailer for it, and he's like, no, this looks like garbage. So I couldn't even get him interested in it. So I pretty much just wrote it off after that, which, I mean, not being a Metal Gear fan to begin with, sure, but they weren't gathering any new fans with this either, which is, I think, their greatest downfall too, because now you've not only lost your old fans, but you've failed to gain new ones. So what are you going to do? You got nothing left.
Yeah, and that's all a fair assessment. There's nothing that you said, even as a huge Metal Gear fan, that I really can disagree with, and I felt the same way for the most part. But I will say, this is a backhanded compliment, but it isn't as bad as people said it was. It's not an amazing game, but it's really fun. I mean, if you enjoy that sort of loop of... so the way the gameplay works, just to clarify, is it's basically Metal Gear Solid 5, but made more primitive. So instead of developing this gigantic base with the craziest tech, you're transported into this wormhole after the base in Metal Gear Solid 5 is destroyed, and you're sort of left to your own devices, and you're told that you basically have to survive in order to try to get home. I believe it's a bit of a social commentary on the position the developers were in, to be honest. But that is kind of the situation. But you do the same kind of thing that you did in previous games. You gather resources, you scavenge, you fight wildlife. This time the main enemies are like these biometal zombies. So the whole conceit is, think about the zombies. You have these huge hordes. The music that you played was from one of these big zombie assaults. Like, they're just coming at you in waves. There's dozens of them. They're getting gradually more aggressive. They're bigger, more dangerous ones. You have to contend with the regular zombies while explosive zombies are coming, and long distance firing zombies are coming, and it can be very stressful. And I think it does a good job for that kind of environment. But in the beginning of the game, you don't even have fresh food and water, so you have to hunt and either luck out on fresh water from old abandoned outposts, or you have to take the risk and drink dirty water until you can refine it and actually drink clean water, which
delicious
is it's a milestone in the game, believe it or not. It's like halfway through before you can actually not risk vomiting from drinking dirty water.
Crazy.
So it's, they really take the whole helplessness but attach the base building mechanic to it, so you don't feel powerful. You feel like you're going from at death's door to just barely able to survive, which makes sense in terms of the power fantasy, I guess you would call it. So
yeah.
I think the game on the whole is effective at what it does, but the gameplay loop isn't quite as fun as it was in Metal Gear Solid 5 or Peace Walker.
Excellent. So we're wrapping up, getting some of our final thoughts on the Metal Gear series. So one question that I've had kind of developing through this, it feels like there's a lot of gems in the non-canonical Metal Gear Solid series, like this Volume 2 that we've done. For a person who wants to get into the Metal Gear Solid series, do you feel that the games we've featured in this show are necessary to enhance your enjoyment of the universe, or would you feel that they could stick to the canonical numbered games and still have a great time?
Other than Rising Revengeance, I would say most of these are just there to dig into if you want more Metal Gear. None of them are bad games. I think, again, what I really like about the series is that there are a lot of game series, I should say, that have these offshoot games I feel like they really did a good job of trying new things in these. Even the ones like Metal Gear Solid for Game Boy Color, which feels like it could just be like a lazy rehash, they did try a few things with the gameplay format in terms of the story-based missions. So I think every one of these is an interesting novelty, and you might find that you really dig into it, but all of the best ones have been brought forward. Like Peace Walker is an official game. You can play it on modern consoles, or at least it's easier to, especially... I found I've become an Xbox gamer over the last 10 years, but their backwards compatibility is great. You can play Revengeance and Peace Walker through the backwards compatibility program, so you don't have to have a 360 to play it, which is really great. The other stuff, I don't know. I think you could kind of go either way. Like, if you are interested in something like the Acid games, definitely try out Acid 2, but it's sort of a take it or leave it thing depending on how you feel about the series. If you really like that universe, if you want a little bit more of it. I mean, I've played all of these games to varying degrees. I would say none of them are essential except for Rising.
Yeah, I feel like, with the exception of probably Acid, most of these games have kind of canonical counterparts. So if you find a canon game that you are really, really into, you have the benefit of having kind of a sister game that will expand upon the stuff that you liked from those canon games. So kind of the same deal with like the Dynasty Warriors, like the Musou games, where if you like Dynasty Warriors 6, there's Dynasty Warriors 6 Extreme Legends, and there's several side games that you can play all based on that kind of main game. And this feels kind of the same, not as much as they're directly based on them, but there's enough of the similar gameplay that you can get a little bit more experience out of it and enjoy it as well. So, very cool. Gene, thank you so much for hanging out with me and talking about Metal Gear again.
I promise this is the last time.
Unless there's more Metal Gear games, which hopefully there won't be, because it feels like it kind of like ended on a note where it needs to end. I mean, unless Kojima decides to come back for one last hurrah and has this giant idea that he wants to do, but I'm really excited for Death Stranding. Like I said at the beginning of the show, I'm a big fan of Norman Reedus. I like the fact that it's an open world game. I really tend to like those kind of games, and the fact that it's not like entirely combat focused, it's not entirely stealth focused. It feels like a grand adventure, and in that it's not just rehashing all of the gameplay elements from Metal Gear Solid, just with different people in a different world. So I don't know what's. We can talk kind of briefly about this. What's your take on Death Stranding, and are you excited about it?
Definitely. If there's anything I've tried to make clear throughout both of these shows is that Kojima is one of these people that is just a creative mind.
Yeah.
Whether you agree with all of his choices, I think some of his story elements in some of these games are a little bit weaker, but this is a man who knows gameplay, even almost back to the original Metal Gear. For the time, it's hard to go back to a 30-year-old game and really get that much out of it, but throughout his career, he's definitely tried to push the boundaries of what gameplay can be while still being fun, and I can imagine that's going to be translated pretty well into the new game, and it's pretty much ready. So all of the learnings he's had from being a creative director for basically his entire career, I don't know if this is going to be the last game that he makes or if he decides to continue, but I definitely want to see what is in store, just because, if nothing else, it looks super weird, and I love that. I think that alone is definitely worth checking out, and from the minds of really great game designers, an original concept, again, you might find some things that are a little bit rough around the edges, but if nothing else, it'll be really interesting and worth playing just to see what craziness is in store.
Exactly. And I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about Death Stranding once it comes out and we've both gotten a few hours into the game. So, speaking of endings, though, we do have an outro track that we're going to play you guys out with. What do we have for the last track of the night?
So, you guys know I like the sort of melodramatic vocal tunes from the Metal Gear series. This is Calling to the Night from Metal Gear Solid Portable Ops. It was composed by Akihiro Honda and arranged by Akihiro Honda and Norihiko Hibino, with lyrics by Nobuko Toda and performed by Natasha Farrow. I wanted to bring this one up because, technically, if you like your weird non-canon, this appeared in the most recent Metal Gear game, Smash Bros. Ultimate. So it was in Smash Bros. Brawl and Ultimate. So this is technically the last appearance of Snake up to this point. in time. So
yeah, it's that Metal Gear game with a cast of a lot of guest characters. We'll just, focus on Solid Snake for that one.
Exactly. It's a great tune. It's a total encapsulation of the series. It's a little bit heartfelt, a little bit goofy, and very, very Metal Gear.
Excellent. Man, so, Gene, in the future, I would love to have you back on the show, and we got to come up with something cool to... I would love to maybe do like a nostalgia show with you or something, because I'm really curious about your childhood and games and what you grew up with. So maybe we can do something like that in the future, or if you want to pick another game series you're really into, we'll come up with something cool for a future episode of the VG Embassy.
I'd love to. I'll give your listeners a break for a few months, but I'll definitely be back.
Awesome. All right, so wrapping up this show, I want to thank Indira J for the art and Trevin Hughes for the podcast theme song. And you can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/group/the VG Embassy and on Twitter at the VG Embassy. Also, you can head over to our Discord. Just go to www.thevgembassy.com and you'll see links to the Patreon site and our Discord site at the top of the page. As always, I'd like to thank our wonderful Patreon patrons. At our tourist level, Cameron Childs, a.k.a. Bruce Irons from The Mad Gear, Michael Bridgewater from Forever Sound Version VGM Podcast, Donovan Orofino, and our VG emissaries, Chris Murray, Chris Myers, Ben the Dyad Dishman, Chris Steenerson, Jordan Worma from the Table to Stage Podcast, Volt Supreme, and David Parrish. Our audio attaché members, Cameron Worma, Carlito from the Heroes 3 podcast, and Scott McElhone, and our VG ambassador, Metal Gear Rex himself, Alex the Messenger. Gene, again, thank you so much for hanging out with me. Please, guys, listen to Pixelated Audio. It is a fantastic show. I've been a fan of theirs for ages and ages and ages. If you love deep dives into series and individual games and interviews with Japanese and Western composers, they're the place to be for incredible archival information on video game soundtracks. So Gene, where can we find you guys on the web?
So you can find us at pixelatedaudio.com, on Twitter, on Facebook. We have a Discord channel where we chat quite a bit. It is in a really amazing community. I mean, you guys have an amazing community at the VG Embassy. We have a lot of crossover. I think I've seen some of the same names in both places, but I just love the shows we've been able to do. I actually joined officially about 20-something episodes. We're at about 121 right now. I joined right around 100, and all of the shows before have been great. We've done some really crazy good interviews recently. We just talked to Megan McDuffie and Chibi Tech. Really awesome shows. We have another great one coming up pretty soon with Saori Kobayashi of Panzer Dragoon Saga and much more. And we hope to do a lot more awesome shows and interviews in future months and years. I have been really happy to be a part of this whole community, and I think you guys know, I got to meet Ed when we went to the Library of Congress in April, which was... sometimes I can't even believe that it still happened. It was so crazy. I'm hugely honored to have been a part of that, and get to know Ed a little bit better and some of our fans, and this whole video game music scene. I didn't know where it would go, but it's already taken me to really amazing places, and I've gotten to talk to so many amazing people.
Yeah, I'm equally as amazed at the large and just positive community that we've fostered around these shows and around the love of video game music. It's such kind of a niche interest, and to find so many like-minded people and so many amazing people and people willing to travel across the country just to hang out with each other for a little while, it really shows how strong friendships can be made over silly things like music that plays in the background of video games. So it's great, and that's why I created the VG Embassy, to foster that community and to have a place for people who don't necessarily have their own podcasts, or podcasts that don't necessarily maybe jive with some content that they want to produce, to come on here and just kind of make the show of their dreams and share their passions and their interests. So with that said, Gene, thank you so much. I know you guys don't really do this kind of a show on Pixelated Audio, so I'm really happy that the VG Embassy was a good place for you to really really share your love for this incredible series.
Definitely. Ed, thanks again. Enjoy your time at MAGFest in a few months. You're going to have a fantastic time.
I cannot wait. That's right. We'll be there at the beginning of January, so that'll be fun. We'll be there with Cam Worma. Carlito will be there. I'm sure that the Mercado brothers will be there, so it'll be a grand old time. All right, guys, so we will see you again in 2 weeks for another episode of the VG Embassy. Peace out, everyone.
To the